Well, why don't we turn to our two subjects at hand for the recording for those following the live stream or YouTube or new to the seminar. Welcome everybody. This is the Kenneth Smith seminar. We've been doing Kenneth Smith seminars of one type or another, according to David, for about 6 years, but this arc in particular has been going on for 3 years. This is Millennia and Microcosm. This is a book that Kenneth Smith, philosopher Kenneth Smith, has already written, but it has not been published yet as a book. It was published as a series of installments in a column called End Times in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal. It was published in the years 1998 to 2000. And in this seminar, we are walking through the chapters one by one in great detail, unpacking the dense writing and elusive, quality of Kenneth's writing to see what all is going on in this text. What is he talking about? What other philosophers and writers is he pointing to? What do they have to say? What is he trying to bring into the text? And as part of that, we're sharing our own experiences. What does the text inspire in us? What does it make us think of? And so on. So we're taking our time. We're not in a hurry to finish. We're on a journey of investigation and discovery and exploration and fellowship and camaraderie. So the part that we're in now, the Millennium Microcosm is broken up into three sections. The first section is about the ancient world and its worldview and trying to learn to see the way that they saw. And then the middle section is about the medieval worldview, doing the same thing, but for that 1,000 years that in recent decades nobody ever taught in school or in philosophy courses. They skipped it. They would just go from the Greeks directly to the Renaissance. And Kenneth says, no, don't skip that one because that's the only of the three epochs of European history that we have documented. That's the only one where we have both the beginning and the end. In the ancient world, we have the end, but not the beginning. And in the modern world, we have the beginning, but not the end. The medieval period has a lot to teach us, and that's what we're in now. We're in a 2 or 3 year section exploring those chapters. We're in chapter 8. The medieval section started in chapter 5, and we're in paragraphs 13 to 15 this week. We are in this is beginning the second year of our medieval studies, and in this second year, we are now interleaving our exploration of Kenneth's text with supplementary materials from early Christian fathers and mothers, desert mothers, mystics, hermits, but also some of what we're going to see today, some of the roots of Christianity we're going to get into this week. Last week and this week we've been talking about the Gospel of Thomas, and this week it's gonna blow up in a big way. We're going to generalize and include Thomas in a larger subject called the agrapha or agrapha, which is the sayings of Jesus that are not documented in the four canonical Gospels. Because after all, the Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel. There's no story, there's no crucifixion, there's no salvation, there's no resurrection. We don't know where he went or what he did. All we have is sayings, one after another. And that was a tradition within the Christian church. And as we will see today, it's a tradition that goes back before the Christian church and includes many interesting sources that we're going to explore. But we're gonna after we explore the agrapha, we will then turn back to the text of paragraphs 13 through 15 in chapter 8. This chapter is called Divine Teleology, Heaven and Hell, and it's comparing and contrasting the medieval concept of heaven and hell and the afterlife and theology with the ancient. How did the Greeks see it by contrast? And that's what's going to make this week so interesting as we show some continuity between the sayings of Jesus and the sayings of ancient Greek philosophers, Hebrew rabbis, and even Egyptian mystics. We're gonna take a long journey here together. So, with that out of the way, why don't we start with? I want to turn our attention to. We're gonna reference a lot of books and a lot of websites today. So feel free to jot down notes or copy things out of the chat if you want. We begin with John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan was chair of the Jesus Seminar during the years that it met. For those who don't, we've talked about it before, but for those who are new to us or don't remember, the Jesus Seminar was an enormous modern project to study, to bring together all of the world's finest biblical scholars. All of the world's finest biblical scholars to examine the available manuscripts that we have for the New Testament, compare and contrast them, try to figure out which ones might represent the original, and also to look for interpolations and corruptions of the text. Their goal was to get back to the authentic sayings of Jesus and strip away, millennia of accretions added by scribes or by, frustrated theologians or what have you, or even just resulting from errors in transmission from early on. So Crossan has made a career of writing several books, a fair number of books, examining the work of the Jesus Seminar in different ways. And one of them that I cited there is called In Fragments, the Aphorisms of Jesus. He has another one called In Parables. Those who like parables might like his In Parables book. And In Parables got wider reviews and more people read it. In Fragments was less read, but I think it is the more interesting book. It's the more interesting book because lots of people write about Jesus's parables, but very few people write about Jesus's fragments, his aphorisms. They kind of blow past them and take them for granted. But as those of us who studied the fragments of Heraclitus or Thales or other early philosophers acknowledge, sometimes these aphorisms are the most concentrated, what do I want to say, summations of the core philosophy of a deep thinker, and they deserve attention. So Crossan's, unlike his In Parables book, which was the latest in a series of many other books that other people had written about the parables, In Fragments is as of the time it was published, the only book ever written that collected together the aphorisms of Jesus. So that makes it interesting. And aphorisms being a major literary form popular in the ancient world, such as at the Oracle of Delphi, they put the stele with all the aphorisms. And then Alexander the Great set up stelae all over the world. Wherever he conquered, he set up stelae with those same aphorisms on them to try to spread the wisdom of the seven sages, of ancient Greece, to as far as the borders of India. We know that aphorism writing was incredibly important. It was an ancient tradition. When we say that the Christians and even the pre-Christian rabbis, of the first century BCE or the first century AD, when we say that they are Hellenized Jews who've been marinating in this kind of Hellenistic milieu, with the beliefs that they have are a cross between Judaism and Hellenism, we need to take that further, and we're going to do that this week. What does it mean to be steeped in Hellenism? What from the Greek world have they been steeped in? Well, this is part of it. They're steeped in aphorisms and the idea that they should be striving to find little concentrations of wisdom, nuggets, and putting together these what the Latin authors would later call florilegia, the flowers of wisdom. What are the highest flowerings of a culture? They're trying to get these beautiful verses together. And nobody really studied this before Crossan. They just flew past it. So let's get into it. One of the things that's interesting about In Fragments is he doesn't just take aphorisms from the four Gospels, the canonical Gospels. He also adds the Gospel of Thomas, which is how it crosses with our Thomas discussion. And of course, as we've seen from the early Christian writings website, the Gospel of Thomas is entirely sayings. That's all it is. No story, just sayings. And I'm going to drop the link in here right now, actually, for reference. So here we go. This is the early Christian writings webpage that has the links to all of the sayings of Jesus according to the Gospel of Thomas. So you can just browse that at your leisure. I hope some of you have in the past week. We'll be talking about it some. One of the things that Crossan and others note is that there is perhaps some continuity. What we see in the Gospel of Thomas and in other sources of the sayings of Jesus, we see that the things that he says often remind us of things that other people previously said. Rabbi Hillel has some overlap. Traditional Jewish sources, which we'll talk about in a bit, often have some of the major elements of the Beatitudes from Matthew show up earlier in rabbinical writings, in the writings of wandering Greek philosophers called cynics, followers of Diogenes, who would walk around the Hellenistic world barefoot, saying that the things that society respects, like wealth and power, are contemptible, and that we should focus instead on caring for our neighbor and on questioning received wisdom. This tradition was all over the Middle East at the time that we're talking about. In fact, there is a writer and theologian, F. Gerald Downing, who believes that he finds a lot of the Cynic tradition in the writings of Jesus. And he has written a number of books and essays. Cynics and Christian Origins, Christ and the Cynics, and Jesus and the Threat of Freedom are some examples in which he compares and contrasts traditional cynic sayings with sayings attributed to Jesus, and shows how there's an enormous amount of overlap. And from his earliest writings to his later writings, Downing is sort of equivocates on the question of, is he saying that Jesus had cynic training? Is he saying that some of the things attributed to Jesus didn't actually say, but cynics said, and people thought it was wise, and Jesus was the wise guy, so they put them in his mouth. In the same way that Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, contemporary scholars now believe a lot of what's in there may not have been said by some specific guy named Lao Tzu, but just if you found something that had a Lao Tzu flavor to it, you would attribute it to him. So, oh, this must be a Lao Tzu thing. In the same way that some of the Jewish writings are attributed to Solomon, and in some cases, we know they can't possibly have been written by Solomon, but they say they're by Solomon anyway, because Solomon's the wise guy. So if you've got a wise saying, it must be Solomon. And so Downing sometimes questions: did Jesus say all of these things, or some of these things that other people said? And then when people in the first century encountered them, they said, "Wow, that's wise. That must be Jesus." And so they'd add it to the sayings collection. Downing's not sure. Downing says another possibility is that the sayings we have from Jesus are Jesus's sayings, but that later writers who'd been steeped in the Cynic tradition recast Jesus's words to make them fit the Cynic structure, because they're preaching to beyond the Jewish converts that they're hoping to bring across. They're also preaching to Gentiles, and a lot of the Gentiles they're preaching to have been marinating in the Cynic tradition. You want to convince people who are used to Cynic sayings that your guy is wise, you could just recast his sayings to sound like Cynic sayings. Change the sentence structure, change the organization, keep the core message, and voila, you start winning over a bunch of converts who go, "Oh yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I know and respect, and maybe I should follow your Jesus guy." Downing never makes up his mind, but he draws a lot of correlations and comparisons. And this is something I wasn't clear on before. I didn't know about the wandering Cynic philosopher tradition. I knew about Diogenes himself. I didn't know that he spawned a whole movement of people who wanted to do the same thing and traveled all over, first the Hellenistic and then the Roman world, wandering around. Well, I mean, you all know the classic story of Diogenes and Plato, right? Plato famously defines a man as a featherless biped, and Diogenes thinks that's just ridiculous. So Diogenes kills a chicken, plucks all its feathers out, walks into the middle of Plato's lecture, hurls down the plucked chicken in the middle of the room, and says, "Behold, Plato's man." And Plato's response is to be annoyed and to think for a moment and say, "Okay, man is a featherless biped having broad, flat nails." But Diogenes was a joker like that. He's constantly trying to stir up trouble. He's trying to provoke people into thinking. He's the guy who wanders around the agora at Athens during daylight with a lantern, as though he's trying to see, and people are trying to ignore him and go about their business. But finally, it's too strange, and they confront him and say, "What on earth are you doing?" He says, "I'm glad you asked. I'm searching for an honest man." And then he'd shine the light on the person, shake his head, and move on. It's just trying to get people to think how much of their lives is dishonest, how much of the things that they're doing are not following the value system that the Greeks respect. So evidently there was a whole movement of people like this who followed in Diogenes' footsteps for many centuries after that, and they're wandering up and down the Alexander's empire, his successor's empire, the Roman Empire, and they're jokers. They're philosophical jokers and troublemakers. And whether Downing's right in any of his particulars, it's certainly true that when you read the more gnomic sayings of Jesus, like the kind that you see in Thomas or in the Q source, which we'll talk about today as well, they have a certain riddling, puzzling, Heraclitean, paradoxical, having fun at the expense of the listener quality to them that is designed to provoke. So it's entirely plausible that there's some kind of, whether it's continuity or influence, it's hard to say, but it's sort of it's almost impossible to ignore. There are collections of cynic sayings out there, and structurally they look a lot like the Gospel of Thomas or some of the others we'll talk about today. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
No, so just looking up, on the contradictions. The famous contradictions is the early life of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. Well, Luke says the more believable story. It's born in Bethlehem. Mary has 40 days of purification, and then they go and make a sacrifice in the temple and go back to Nazareth. And then Matthew's come up with this story that they're being persecuted by Herod the Great, who was actually dead by the time Jesus was born. And they went and hid for 2 years in Egypt. Now, that's a believable story too, but it's probably not about Jesus. It's because Herod the Great was known for killing any potential rival, even if they're a child. Oh, this person has greater claim to the throne than me. I'll have to knock them off. So yeah, that story probably happened, but it wasn't Jesus. So it sounds like Mark, all over the place, is trying to establish Jesus' royal credentials, which probably never actually happened. And he's trying to confirm, well, the prophecy said this. So this actually happened in Jesus's life. So I've got as fine a piece of work as it is, I'm having great doubts about Matthew now.
Yes, yes. It's one of the interesting things that biblical scholarship has concluded. And by concluded, I don't mean absolutely proven, but sort of the majority opinion of serious literary scholars is that Matthew and Luke, where Matthew and Luke differ from Mark, everybody agrees Mark's earliest. He's of the four canonical gospels, his is earliest, and probably earliest by several decades. Um, you can see that Matthew and Luke have both read Mark, and in places they change things by amplifying. They sort of up the fantastical and exciting in the stories. They're trying to make a juicier story. And all of those parts are questionable. But there is something else going on. Matthew and Luke also have a certain amount in common that's not found in Mark, aside from their amplifications. There's some sayings, there's some incidents, and so on. And this has led most scholars since the 19th century to believe there was another old source that's now lost, and they gave it the code name Q which stands for the German Quelle, which means source. And they're saying this earlier lost source, you can sort of reconstruct some of what must have been in it based on things that are in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. And they're then concluding that Matthew and Luke, therefore, were writing. They took what Mark said and they took what the Q source said, and they put them together as, okay, these are the two sources of transmission we have about the life of Jesus. And then for their respective audiences and their respective purposes, they didn't just fictionalize, they added some stuff, that they just felt like adding because they thought it would make a better story. And all of that, the Jesus Seminar concludes, all of that material that clearly doesn't come from Mark or Q is probably not real. This is probably not the real Jesus we're seeing here. This is probably Matthew's trying to make an argument. He's trying to persuade some of his contemporaries, and he thinks it would go better for him if instead of him saying something, if he could just stick it into the mouth of Jesus, then those people would have to listen because Jesus said it. Um, I guess he's trusting nobody will compare Mark with what he wrote and say, well, if Jesus said that, why didn't Mark say that he said it? Uh, it's curious, right?
Well,
So
Luke famously, of course, combines the birth of Jesus with the census of Quintilius,
yes,
which again happens years after his birth.
yes, it can't. Some of these comparisons, some of these lineups in the story that they're making can't possibly be true. Um, and it leads one to think that neither Matthew nor Luke was a firsthand witness. I mean, whoever wrote Matthew and whoever wrote Luke, they were not firsthand witnesses to the life of Jesus. They're using other sources, and they make some mistakes. We see the same in John. John gives us a lot more details, a lot of traveling around from this town to that town, and so on. And John gets the geography wrong frequently. He'll talk about to get to this village, they pass through this village, and those some of those villages are still around. They've been there for many thousands of years now, and they don't occur in that order on the road. You don't. It's like saying I was going from York to London, and on the road to London, of course, we stopped at Paris as you do, and then Rome. And then when we went a little further, we got to London. And this is what it's like. What John's geography reads like that to people who know the geography of Palestine. They're like, this is not John clearly has not walked these roads. He's writing about things he doesn't actually know. Um, and so the Jesus Seminar tries to figure out, well, what could account for this? And they're saying, well, what accounts for it is probably what happened is that in the years immediately after Jesus's death, it was his sayings that got everybody excited. Everybody went and wrote down what they could remember he told them. They're like, because that's what was being passed around in the Jewish traditions and the Greek traditions and everything else. They're like, we want to remember the memory of this incredibly wise guy, and the best way to do that is to put together our own sayings collection. But you go a few decades later, and some of the witnesses have died off, and people start saying, okay, tell me more about the guy who said these things. I mean, yes, these are nice sayings, but what was his life like? And now you've got people who were never there going, crap. we gotta piece together what we can and try to cobble together a picture of who he was and what he
There
did,
is
not just what he
there is
said.
another important element, and this is often forgotten by people today, but until recently, in all most cultures, our own culture, and going back a few thousand years, we're talking about class societies.
Yes,
And people think, well, today they claim they're all equal, which isn't working out that great always.
yes,
But they forget that Jesus belonged to what was essentially a middle class family because they were professionals of some variety.
carpenter.
Yeah, the vast amounts of the population are just labourers, douloi, people who were living hand to mouth,
Yeah,
who didn't have a plan in life, who didn't have any great skill, and were disregarded as cattle. There were the aristocracy were like the seraphim. They were at the top. They're the important ones, and then there's the Pharisees and the professionals. Okay, they're part of the landscape. And then there's the people who, the vast majority, the lowest order, these ordinary people are expendable. We don't understand that anymore in our present society. You know, if a plague came along and didn't touch the aristocracy or didn't touch the Banausoi and just killed all the douloi, they would lament, where's our cheap labour? But as far as they're concerned, their nation has lost nothing other than cheap labour. only the people at in the hierarchy mattered
Right,
greatly.
right.
Thank you.
That's their point of view for sure. Thanks for stressing that. It needs to be stressed. Yeah. So there's a link, by the way, to a Wikipedia article about the Jesus Seminar for those who haven't heard of it outside this group. You don't have to take my word for it. I have a lot of their books over on my bookshelves of biblical studies. They're among other things, they not only did the work I was talking about, but they also produced their own new translations with extensive footnotes. And the footnotes help you to see which passages are probably authentic and which passages show evidence of corruption. And they tell you what the evidence is. So you can sort of follow along in their work and say, well, yeah, the passages before and after are clearly using language from about the year 70, but this passage in the middle is using language and idiom that nobody invented. It was 100 years later before. It's as though people are saying, Jesus says, "Blessed are the groovy, for they shall get down with their funky selves." And the Jesus seminar goes, funky, groovy, and getting down. That is not the lingo of 70 CE. That is the lingo of several centuries later. So we can be pretty sure this passage is an interpolation. And you'd think to yourself, well, come on. I mean, if somebody was trying to forge or interpolate, wouldn't make that mistake, right? It's like, no, the whole science of how languages change over time was developed thousands of years later. I mean, it took a long time for people to clue in how radically languages change and how you can use that as evidence to see when texts have been contaminated with. So anyway, the Jesus Seminar, their publications, their translations are quite interesting, and they're one of the sources that I'm using in today's work. All right, so far so good. So our general topic is the agrapha, or agrapha, which is the sayings of Jesus not found in the four canonical gospels. And that comes up because John Dominic Crossan's in Fragments, it draws from the four canonicals, and it also draws from the Gospel of Thomas, and I believe it also draws from the Gospel of Peter, which is a non-canonical gospel, and from the preachings of Peter, which is a lost work that's partially preserved in the writings of Clement of Alexandria from the next century. He cites the preachings of Peter, and the preachings of Peter looks again like another sayings gospel, like Thomas and like Hugh. It looks like another one of these collections of sayings that Clement evidently had at hand, but we don't. It's been lost since then. If it weren't for Clement quoting this thing, we wouldn't even know it existed necessarily. Uh, and then he includes the Gospel of Peter because some of the first century, some of the second century and third century works that we know are not authentic, and that even the early church fathers who were making the canon were pretty sure weren't authentic. Many of them not only quote out of the four canonical gospels, but will also quote out of Peter. And the evidence suggests that people used to think Peter would deserve to be canonical. It was respected just as much as the others. So Crossan includes that too. And from them, he mines everything that looks like an aphorism of Jesus's. And you put them all together in a list from all of these different sources and sort them according to subject matter, and it really starts to feel like the fragments of Heraclitus or something else. It's as you can see from I gave you the link there to the Thomas. As you can see from going through Thomas, it has that riddling, dark, obscure, chewy quality. These sayings do. When people talk about the voice of Jesus coming through despite the various contaminations of the scribes and theologians of later years, part of what they're referring to is this sort of dark, riddling, gnomic, do you have eyes to see and ears to hear quality of the author. So let's just do a quick retrospective a little bit on some of the history of these sayings traditions, because it's all very relevant. So first of all, the earliest thing that I found so far is the Egyptian instruction of Amen and Mope, and it's from way back, 1300 to 1075 BCE, and it is clearly self-identified as wisdom literature. Amen and Mope, wants to pass on some wisdom. I think it's to his son, And so he begins doing like Polonius does in Hamlet. He starts declaiming, all of these little pithy sayings. And of course, Polonius is made fun of in Hamlet, both by Hamlet and presumably by Shakespeare for being a blowhard, which is why when we all say brevity is the soul of wit, we're sort of missing the point, which is that it was stated by the most the perfect character of a blowhard who has no brevity to him whatsoever is the guy who says brevity is the soul of wit. It reminds me of how Donald points out there's passages in Plato that a modern reader doesn't understand at all because the guy saying it, who's declaiming about courage, is the general who famously every Greek knew was the guy who ran away in a battle. And he's the one telling us about courage. And Plato and Socrates mean us to point and laugh, but we don't get the joke. And such it is with brevity is the soul of wit. Anyway, Amene Mope, it's out there. You can find some references to it and some of the things that are in it. But it is believed to have been an influence on Proverbs. There are passages in the book of Proverbs that exactly mirror passages from the instruction of Amenemope, and it shows how the Jewish literary tradition isn't just an insular, incestuous tradition that came from one tiny group of people that never talked to anybody else. The Jews got around. There's the Babylonian captivity. There was time in Egypt. There was exposure to Hellenistic. There was access to the Silk Road. I mean, they have all this different sources of wisdom that they're drawing upon to try to pull into their rabbinical, wisdom tradition. And this is one of them. Next up, we have propositions of Thales. The Greeks would later claim that Thales was, the first philosopher, let alone the first Greek philosopher. It is, as we know from the instruction of Amenemope, there was already a long-standing wisdom tradition, and as Thales himself acknowledges and others do, Thales didn't come up with these things on his own. He studied, and among other things, he studied in Egypt. He went and learned. Stephen has already pointed out in the past, Babylon had an ancient tradition of science and learning and mathematics, and we know that was an influence on the Greeks. We know the Phoenicians, who traveled widely across the Mediterranean and elsewhere, that they had their own traditions. I mean, this is the route of transmission by which the Greeks even pick up writing itself is from the Phoenicians, and that wasn't the only thing they got from them. But I bring up the propositions of Thales not just because of the famous three that Aristotle cites, right? That water is the arche, the primary source and authority from which all things come. But then he says the other two that almost nobody quotes when they're busy dismissing Thales as a philosopher who thinks he's obsessed with water. That they miss that he then says topan and sukon, the all has soul in it. It is alive. There's soul in everything. Nothing just is. Everything has a character to it. And that character is the soul of the thing that is responsible for its behavior. And from that derives the statement, and I don't know if Thales said it or if other people are paraphrasing Thales when they say it. Phusis is to the cosmos as psyche is to the soma. That is to say, what we think of as nature, or the laws of nature, or the hidden harmony of nature, Heraclitus's logos, is to the universe, the cosmos itself, as our own soul is to our own body, the soma, right? That um, the thing cannot be understood just as a solitary unity. It has to be understood as a dialectic between form and matter. The universe isn't just a place. It's an organism. It has behavior. It has logic. It has a kind of intelligence, and that comes from its character, which is the physis. Just like our behavior, our personality, what we do and don't do, what we notice and don't notice, that comes from our character, which is in our psyche, our soul, the breath of life in us. He then continues in his third proposition, to theon. That's like to pan theon. The pan is understood here, saying the all is also sacred. It's full of daimons or gods. It is to be respected. We are to live according to nature and respect that there is a wisdom in the way that the cosmos has been constructed, and that wisdom is sacred. It is greater than we are. It's survived longer than we have. It's as Heraclitus will later say, it's smarter and more rational than we are. It is rare that a human being. What? I was just this weekend. I was fiddling around with some philosophical writing, and I was looking at one of Kenneth's favorite quotes is from George Bernard Shaw. Except for the 9 months before he draws his first breath, no man manages his life as well as a tree does. It's like, there is some kind of intelligence without a brain or a neuron. The tree has some kind of intelligence that allows it to pursue the things that a tree ought to pursue to be a successful tree. And trees do that more consistently than human beings pursue the things they ought to pursue in order to be successful human beings. We have a level of confusion that they don't have. And so in this is this concept that we should be looking to the world, we should be looking to nature, we should be looking for the deeper, the hidden harmony, the intelligence that underlies things, which is to the Greeks sacred. Um, Gnothi Seauton, although it's inscribed on the Oracle of Delphi at the Temple of Apollo, it is often attributed later on to Thales. They say that the sayings on those stelae that I talked about, that were the wisdom sayings that were set up all over the Hellenic world, that they were written by the seven sages of Greece. And sadly, the Greeks can't quite agree on who the seven sages are. They all put Thales there. Many of them put Solon. There's Pisistratus. There's a number of people cited, and there's a number of people who claim to know which saying was created by which person. But as far as I know today, we're just not entirely sure whether or not Thales was the one who said know thyself. Maybe he did. Maybe that's where that comes from. Um, but this last one here that I really want to draw our attention to: how shall we lead the best and most righteous life? By refraining from doing what we blame in others. Do unto others as you would have others do unto yourselves is a restatement of this. This predates Jesus by, I don't know, 545 years, 578 years. It's hard to say. It's some almost half a millennium earlier. We have essentially the same saying with different words. That saying, we can learn from um, by thinking about putting ourselves in other people's place, we can come to understand justice. We can evaluate the justice or injustice of our own actions. If we imagine that they were being done to us by a different person, would we like them or not like them? And this shows up again in as Ari will later point out in today's call. This later shows up in rabbinical traditions, Jewish traditions, and I'm gonna take us to some stuff about that shortly, very shortly. But a few steps first before we get there. Um, oh, let's see. Joe needs to rejoin. Okay, there we go. Next up, there are a lot of other pre-Socratic propositions after Thales. This wisdom literature approach catches on, and people start thinking, if you want to be a wise guy, you got to you got to say things in the wise way that people like Thales have said things. You need to create that gnomic concentration, that riddling form. And so there are all kinds of statements I could have put here. I only quoted a few. Nothing to excess. Medinagon is often attributed to Solon. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but he's one of the guys they often cite as one of the seven sages of ancient Greece. Anaximenes. Anaximenes, people like to write him off as, oh, like Thales is the water guy, Anaximenes is the air guy. But you can see in this statement something more profound than that. As our soul is air and holds us together, so a breath of air embraces the whole cosmos. This is the phusis is to the cosmos as psuche is to the soma, right? The breath of air is the psuche. That's your soul. That's your spirit. Um, and again, so this has got character. Psuche has character implicit in it. Um, so when Anaximenes is saying that the universe is made out of air, we all go, ha ha, that's funny. The universe isn't just a gas. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Although, to be fair, since most of the universe is hydrogen and helium, Anaximenes is closer to the truth than most of us who think that the important part of the universe is our TV set and our chair and our computer. He's closer to the literal truth of the physics and cosmology as we understand it. But maybe that's not what he's talking about at all. Maybe he's saying that you can't understand things unless you understand their character, their nature, which is what's in their psuche, which is the breath of life in them. We just say, haha, air. And he's saying you have to study character, and we're completely missing it. Um, Oh, the do unto others chat. Yeah, let me since Joe dropped off, and came back, I'm gonna post it again. So there it is, right? How should we lead the best and most righteous life by refraining from doing what we blame in others? All right, so there's Anaximenes. Leucippus, nothing happens at random, but everything for some reason and of necessity. And we know the Greek for necessity is ananke. She who is even deeper than the fates, and the Greeks believe the fates are deeper than the gods. In other words, it is a statement about causality. This is prototypical science, right? Before science has been created as a discipline, here's Leucippus saying causality creates a giant web in the cosmos that weaves everything together. There isn't anything random. There is a meaning to the structure of the universe, and that meaning is causality. And it is incumbent upon us to study those relationships. All of this is just comes directly out of what Leucippus is saying. Um, Zen kata fusin, live according to nature. If you were looking for a nutshell statement, an aphorism that no Greek version of Hume to doubt it. Yeah, that's right. Zen kata fusin, live according to nature. If you're looking for an aphorism that sums up the entire Greek worldview as Kenneth describes it in chapter 4, it would be this concept that the ancient worldview is fusiocentric. It's centered in nature. It says nature's smarter than we are, and we need to study it and live in a harmony with it. This is sort of what the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu is saying, written about the same time, thousands of miles away. All right. After the pre around, well, I mean, I guess you could include them in the pre-Socratics, but of particular note in leading up to these sayings traditions of Jesus, we have to talk about the Delphic maxims, which was what was inscribed on the stele when they set up the stones and they carved their hundreds of little aphorisms in there that they claim were from the seven sages like Thales and Solon, and then they spread them all over the place. We used to think that tradition was just mythology. Until recent centuries, we thought that was just something people claimed the Greeks did. But it's in the last century we finally found the evidence. We found some writers who claim to have transcribed the contents, and then we were still not sure. Well, maybe it's bullshit. He's just making this up and saying. But then we actually found one in I think it was Afghanistan, somewhere near close to India. We found one of the stelae set up by Alexander's army, and it's partially broken at the bottom, so we don't have it entirely complete. But what we have matches the contents and the order of Stobaeus's list of what the maxims were. And so now people have finally come around to saying, yeah, the Greeks were obsessed with this aphoristic wisdom literature. They were so obsessed that they're like, okay, I'm going to take time out from conquering the world to stick up this little state. It's like a Greek Bible, if you will. It's like the book of Proverbs. It's just entirely these statements, and they thought it was that important. It had to go with them. It had to travel with them. So when we say that the first century BCE and AD, or CE, Jews were Hellenized Jews, drawing off both a Jewish tradition and a Hellenic tradition, that Hellenic tradition has to include these maxims and this tradition of gnomic aphoristic writing. That's part of what it means to be Hellenized. Um, I quote all the time Heraclitus. Kenneth quotes Heraclitus all the time. I quote Heraclitus all the time. I'm just going to drop him in passing, just showing some sample characters. Fate, nature loves to hide. Sopron is the greatest virtue. Expect the unexpected. He too has a bunch of stuff in here, uh, um, and he has things about not being selfish. And he usually expresses it in terms of epistemology, and says if you try to have a private intelligence of your own, you're going to be an idiot. You have to subscribe to the shared intelligence that we all have. And what's shared is the logos, nature's intelligence, the hidden harmony that underlies all things. That's what the shared intelligence is. And if we would all give up our private intelligences and attach ourselves to that shared intelligence, we could have a world of harmony. That's how we could make a better society. Stop squabbling with each other and arguing over who's right. Start listening to nature. He's got, again, proto science is in there, um, along with an ethical system. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just really quickly. In regards to, how shall we live the best and most righteous life by refraining from doing what we blame in others? I mean, I think that that's representative of a higher level of consciousness that you were actually just referring to about this idea, this shared intelligence factor. But I also think it's just a, understanding between the self and other, right? So that once you understand yourself, that you realize the differentiation between you and someone else, but that there are the similarities as well. And this has like kind of the basis of cosmopolitanism in a way, where you start to see, not just yourself within this small group, even. So even when this idea of self and other, it starts to expand and expands beyond, a locality, and you start to see yourself part of an interconnected whole. And so some of the ideas of cause and effect, kind of come into this when we start thinking about that. What is, you know, what causes us to do X and Y and whatever. And so it's also the ability to imagine and to imagine ourselves in another person's position, which is another form of consciousness, I would say. So that's a very fundamental. I mean, you can go back to even Philo and people like that when you're talking about the logos, and when you're getting into this, you're starting to see this is the genesis of all this type of thinking, and it's basically about our relationships with each other. So it's really an important point because this is something that obviously Stephen brings up all the time, is that what is in us, the thing that we always blame other people for, and he uses the Nazis as an example, that is actually in us. So therefore, instead of assessing as to the conditions by which actually created that, we just, it's reverting to blame is like a lower form of understanding, I would say. And so instead of looking at the kind of the environment, and then how you were mentioning even working with nature, within nature, and operating within nature, then what is our nature, and then thinking about that, and kind of what is optimal, given our circumstances, as far as how to behave towards one another when it comes to working together within the natural order of things. So I mean, it's just an interesting take on the idea of cosmopolitanism in general, because it starts with the idea of just the self and the other. But this higher degree of consciousness starts to expand. You see it expanding beyond the tribe, beyond the concept of a country. And this is where the Greeks are saying, I'm a citizen of the world. They knew that the idea of a country is a concept. It's made up. It's the concept is actually captured only because we have language, so that we could actually create it, and that it's an artificial boundary. It's not a boundary within nature. And then so that getting back to Diogenes, and thinking about it, where you're a citizen of well, the world, and technically Socrates you can go back to with that, but
That's brilliant. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, that's an example of a major thread that's running through all this, right? That Kenneth Smith talks about the way that the Olympian religion was an artificial religion, and it went hand in hand with the promotion of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and with the creation of the Olympic Games and the Isthmian Games and the Nemean Games and the other one that I always forget. The four different sets of competitions that the Greeks clawed their way out of the Great Dark Age by saying it's not enough for us to be tribal. When we're a different culture that was tribal but not so competitive, it could be fine for them to be tribal. But we're Greeks and we can't stop fighting. Competition is in our nature. And if we don't, this is by the way, this is from Nietzsche's essay Homer's Contest that I'm citing here. The Kenneth Smith line, which is that the Greeks actually realized that the Trojan War and the collapse in the Dark Age was their fault, what they were struggling with, the illiteracy, the savagery, the fall from a higher state, they did to themselves and they did it to the larger world, and that to get out of that, they had to replace conflict with contest, with competition, and that they deliberately set up the Olympian Games and the like, not just as a place to come together and compete, but that there would be a sacred law that would happen at the exact same time that said, if you're fighting a war, but the date comes around for the Olympian Games, you have to stop your war right now. And if you don't, that's blasphemy. All the other Greeks can turn on you. You're an asshole. You have to be stopped. You're one of those, you're going to wreck our new society the way that our forefathers wrecked the original Greek society. And we're not having that. We're sick of it. So we set these times aside every year. We set a time aside when we stop fighting and we come together and we compete in other ways. We compete by who can throw a shot put the farthest. We compete by who can hurl the discus or the javelin or can wrestle. And we compete by our ability to recite our wisdom literature to each other. We're gonna have that relay race, baton passing version of, can we cite the entire history of the Trojan War? And everybody stands up and recites until they fall down, and the next guy stands up and recites until he falls down. And we're gonna have competitions for who can make the greatest tragedies out of our sacred stories. And all of this is based on the idea that we need to broaden our sense of identity beyond the polis. It's not enough to be territorial and parochial. That way leads to destruction, self-destruction. That we need to have something larger than ourselves. So they're trying to create a pan-Hellenic identity, that transcends those boundaries. And given that was well understood by the Greeks, even though by hardly any moderns who study the Greeks, but it was well understood by the Greeks as their intentional anthropoculture project, that they're going to try to make themselves into something new. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that we later find Socrates saying, I don't want to just be a citizen of a polis. I want to be a citizen of the world, the cosmos. And then that we have Diogenes actually coining the term cosmopolitan, as his restatement of the same idea that Socrates had, that we need to dilate our minds and our identities and our loyalties beyond, the traditional political boundary to encompass everybody. And in that, there is a nugget of love one another, isn't there? Because if my polis is the whole cosmos, and as Heraclitus says, within the polis, the thing that describes and identifies the polis is that you have solidarity with each other. You all stick together. You fight for your laws, the laws of the polis, like you would fight for your city walls if you were being invaded. This is the comparison Heraclitus makes. Assume somebody's trying to cross the wall with spears and kill you. How hard do you fight to keep them from getting at your children? That's how hard you should fight within the polis to keep you all on the same keel, obeying the law of the polis. That's what it meant to be a polis, is that the tribes were welding together into a larger structure. And here we have Socrates and Diogenes essentially restating the Olympian project to say the polis, even the polis, is not enough. It needs to be the whole cosmos. We have to fight for everybody. The whole world has to be the polis that we think of as the boundary within which we have each other's backs. So there's it's like you're saying, there's stuff here that leads into the later wisdom tradition of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the foundation of ethics itself. I mean, and it's also the foundation of how to live a good life. I mean, what you just brought up there was actually very interesting with the distinction between going from conflict to contest. And the only reason I don't want to get too far off in this because it's not directly related, but it is a very important thing in the sense that these are how still today things like states of flow are actually achieved, right? So there is, the idea that, games themselves, that how, there's a certain degree of tranquility that comes along with that versus something like conflict, obviously, which is, just something else. But if you think about it in terms of that, it's tranquility to a certain degree. There's a certain degree of tranquility that exists instead of conflict. And there is an ethics that kind of exists in that. I know that that's a very loose connection. But I mean, if you're really getting to a state of ataraxia in that sense, then, inner tranquility, you kind of think about it in terms of, how do you achieve that then? Right. And I think that that's, going from the idea of competition, but when you go from competition within a conflict, but competition within a contest. And that's an interesting way of kind of looking at it, because then, I don't know, that helps us at least engage with each other in a more healthy way. And games have traditionally been used as distractions and still are. I mean, there's sports washing even today that this goes on, and that's a well-known tactic actually by totalitarian regimes to actually distract both people in the world from their behaviors. But it's just an interesting connection that when you mentioned that, it kind of set off a couple of things of how states of flow and even the psychology of people work within that.
Thank you, Joe. Pythian is the one I never remember. Isthmian, Nemean, Olympian, and Pythian from Delphi, from the Python. There's the link to the Wikipedia article about the Pan-Hellenic Games. So we only resurrected one of them. We got the Olympics going again, and by we I mean the Germans. But what we haven't done, there's two things we haven't done. One is we haven't made it a horrific crime to continue fighting a war during the Olympic Games. So we're missing part of the spirit of the Greek spirit of the Olympic Games. But the other thing is we only do it once every 4 years. And it was true that the Olympian Games only happen once every 4 years, but they had 3 other games for the years in between. The Nemean, the Isthmian, and the Pythian. So all right, so there's a little background on this stuff. And Gospel of Thomas, saying 26, Stephen shared, you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but you do not see the beam in your own eye. When you cast the beam out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to cast the mote from your brother's eye. Well, we've heard that one before, haven't we? This is the thing is, we can say that we can call the Gospel of Thomas non-canonical and say, well, we should just ignore it then. But if we're actually ignoring it, then we have to ignore sections of Matthew, because this shows up again in Matthew. So it's either legitimate in both places or it's legitimate in neither place. And once we start making these recognitions about the enormous amount of crossover in the spirit of the sayings that are in Thomas, the more we start to have a growing problem in distinguishing why some things are in the canon and others are not. Sometimes it's clear, and sometimes it's really, really questionable on why these divisions should be made. But I'm going to move on now to 5 Jewish sources of wisdom that we can cite as examples for things that flowed into the early Christian wisdom literature tradition. And we start with Ecclesiastes. There's Donna. So, there's there are several books that claim to have been, or that are attributed to Solomon, and then I've got a couple that are not. But Ecclesiastes is wisdom literature, right? It includes aphorisms and proverbs and sayings. And look at the dates on Ecclesiastes. I mean, by the time Ecclesiastes is being written, somewhere in that time frame, there's already this for over 1,000 years. There's been this tradition throughout the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world and North African world of collecting together aphorisms and sayings. What the Jews are doing in Ecclesiastes is what everybody else is doing in their own literature, much of which is doubtless lost, and probably it's what non-literate societies are doing in their own collections of oral literature. One of the things that I was doing in the last several years is I was studying poetry from around the world, from especially non-European, non-English and non-Chinese, non-Japanese, outside the usual sources we go to. And you discover that all over Africa, there are countries that revere poetry and they revere their poets. They revere them the way that the medieval Christian church would revere saints. And these people are included. People would travel from all over a country in Africa or from other countries in order to just to hear one of these poets speak, because the beautiful language and attempts to encapsulate wisdom are so meaningful to these people. And you got to think, this is not a change. This is a human thing that we've been doing for a long time. So the Jews are doing it too. They're trying to, in addition to writing about their history in other books, they're also trying to collect their own wisdom literature. And we know that wisdom literature is coming from multiple sources. It's especially clear in the book of Proverbs, which, although attributed to Solomon, comes from many sources, including, as we said, the instruction of Amenemope from Egypt from 1,000 years before. You can't really put a date on the book of Proverbs for that reason. It's got at least 6 different sections in it with material that came from completely different sources. There's some debate about whether some of this, maybe some of what's in Proverbs, shows no sign of Hellenic influence. Some of it, in other words, might date back to the Babylonian captivity, centuries towards the earlier age range. And some of it might come from a Hellenic period. Some of it might come from indigenous Jewish culture. It's hard to say now, but whatever the source is, it's clearly an important part of what people are thinking and talking about in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE as Christianity is being born. Next up, something I didn't even know about a week ago. Although Ari will chide me because I'm sure it's well known in Jewish circles, the Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fundamental principles, or chapters of the fathers, or sayings of the fathers. It's a collection of ethical sayings, and that Wikipedia link is not a bad place to start. Although you'll probably want to follow up and get yourself a copy of it, because it is full of juicy aphorisms. And as you're reading your way through, even just the ones selected for Wikipedia, as you're sifting through them, you can ask yourself, didn't Jesus say something kind of like this? And frequently the answer is yes. Jesus is, and this, both predates and postdates him, but basically the idea is that the things Jesus is saying fall within a tradition that has been going on for some time. And you can cite specific example after example after example of comparisons. We talk about Jesus as though he's a revolutionary who came up with the idea of loving one another for the first time. That is clearly not the case. Whether it was revolutionary to give your life in a sacrifice out of love or not, to at least espouse that we should be loving one another is a major recurring theme that we're going to see over these centuries. All right, the Pirkei Avot. I was very excited to learn about that, and I'm going to spend some time reading it. Not today, but on my own. I advise you to do the same. While we're talking about sources that lots of people don't know, the second obscure source, which again probably some people on this call and probably already know about, is the book of the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach. Not Jesus, son of Joseph, not Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus, son of Sirach, who lived 2 centuries before Jesus of Nazareth. And this is another wisdom literature book. It's got all kinds of sayings in it, like Proverbs, like Ecclesiastes, like the Pirkei Avot, like the sayings of the 7 sages, the Delphic maxims. This is another wisdom literature collection. And here too, we see there are a number of passages in Sirach that have exact parallels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. I mean, it's all over the place. If you look at these articles, they'll just introduce you to a few of the comparisons where you go, oh yeah, okay, Jesus said that, and so did Jesus, the earlier Jesus. He also said it. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Not much, but I've often wondered about wisdom literature, and even the name wisdom literature, because when you have all these aphorisms, it takes real wisdom to know which one applies to the given situation. Is it birds of a feather flocking together or opposites attracting? You know, you have to be able to detect what underlying arche needs to be evoked at the present time. Memorizing these things or learning them doesn't it doesn't seem to be the real trick, because there's a counter aphorism, I think, for almost every aphorism.
I was just reading about that before the call. I can't remember. I think it's Proverbs that has one that's something about, don't listen to a fool. And literally the very next proverb says you have to listen to a fool so that you understand how foolishness works. And it's like they're back to back next to each other. And that discussion, I think it was in the Wikipedia article, it's talking about how, the Jewish canon, trying to figure out what was going to be in the Tanakh, that took a long, just like the Christian Bible, that took a long time for the Jews to decide what's in and what's out. And likewise, some of what's out are things that a lot of contemporary Jews liked and would have preferred to have seen in, and possibly vice versa. And one of the ones that gave them conniptions was Proverbs because they're from so many sources. It's one thing if we say there are contradictions in the New Testament, but to literally have two back-to-back proverbs that say the opposite it goes right to what you're saying, which is, sometimes it's not enough to have this stuff. The real art is in knowing when and how to apply it.
I think they're both true. It's not that they contradict each other. They're both true, but they apply to different situations. When is the fool telling you something, and when is he distracting you from something? It's judgment. Sophrosune. Here, I'll say so. Here, just
it calls for sophrosune, doesn't it? we need the compass in the brain. All right, next up, the fifth of the books is the book of wisdom of Solomon. And in these again, some of these are excluded from the Tanakh or excluded from the Protestant Bible, but might be included in the Septuagint, which means at one point the Jews did consider them part of their canon. And likewise, that some of them are in, say, the Catholic Bible or the Eastern Orthodox Bible. Christians don't agree about some of these books, whether they're in or they're out. But even some of the ones that are out, people like Martin Luther read them anyway and said, it's not a sacred canonical writing, but it's still an ecclesiastical writing. It's important to our church. They start making these fine distinctions about are we going to include it or not include it. So this is 5 examples from Jewish literature. I have no doubt Ari could give us a much longer list, but that show this same tradition of collecting sayings and aphorisms and encouraging people to read them. Some of these would be bundled up, like maybe Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and the Book of Wisdom might be bundled up together without the rest of the Bible, without the rest of the Tanakh, without the rest of the Old and New Testament in the Christian case, and they would just carry those around, and look at them every morning as part of their prayers. Now, in some cases, these aphoristic sections of the overall works were the sections that were the spine of people's faith, even more than the Gospels, even more than Genesis or Exodus, that they would work on these proverbs and aphorisms over and over and over, trying to understand them. And I read some speculation today that was suggesting that part of what we're seeing is that there are numerous approaches to try to get people to be thoughtful and wise. You might do it through parables. You might do it through stories of the life of Jesus. You might do it through straight theological lecturing. But you might do it through these aphorisms and sayings, and that's why both the Tanakh and the New Testament include multiple examples of these different approaches to teaching. And the thing I was reading was saying the aphorisms in particular typically would not have been what you saw in your temple or church. I mean, they be cited from time to time, but they weren't usually the focus. They were the focus at home, instruction by parents to children, or uncles or aunts to their nieces and nephews. It often took the place of reciting these aphorisms and sayings and talking about them together with the young to get them to think about. I think, like Donald's saying, how do you use this stuff is where the real wisdom is. When and how do you use it or not use it? How are you supposed to derive guidance in life from it? And that's probably why they're in the Tanakh and the New Testament, is because this was the household religion of Judaism and of Christianity that corresponds to the temple religion or the cathedral religion of other parts of these works. All right, so this brings us to the last four that are on my list. Now we move beyond the Jewish and beyond the Greek to things that are now in this larger context that we've talked about. We can only interpret these as being informed by these Jewish and Greek aphorism and saying traditions. Because once you've read all the works that I've put on the list so far, once you've read or even just scanned those, when you look at these last four, you will be unable to escape the conclusion that these were heavily influenced by the stuff that we've just been talking about. So the first on our list is the Q source, the lost Q source, which people have had to reconstruct. What were Matthew and Luke reading other than Mark that made them write their gospels the way that they did? And Burton Mack's The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins, is a great source on this. But you can also read the article from early Christian writings or look at other sources as well, where they tell you how they did the reconstruction, how did they figure out what used to be in there. And once again, a lot of what's in there is not the crucifixion, the resurrection, the apocalypse. A lot of the things we think of as Christianity are not apparently in Q. It's more of these sayings and parables that are in there. Um, Again, also not a lot of biographical material, but a lot of this sayings literature. And so this is around 50. And of course, as we remember, 50 is about the same time that the Gospel of Thomas is being written, as we talked about last week. And it's about the same time that Paul is writing his epistles, which are from an entirely different tradition that's not interested in sayings. It's interested in salvation and in, as Sharon points out, in how do we successfully organize ourselves in the early church in order to be a going concern. And it again, when I've said there's maybe a dozen or more threads of early Christian sects that aren't very aware of each other and that have entirely different things that they focus on out of Jesus. And it's only later that they're woven together into a single fabric of Christianity. Today, the way to think about it is today we're not looking really at some of the others. We're not looking at Paul. We're really just looking at this one, this one thread, which is the aphorism tradition. Oh, Stephen's doing a thing. Hey, look at that. 18th December, huh? I might see if I can attend. I know your time zones and my time zones are just devastatingly far apart.
I'm sorry we don't do Zoom. It's just a a physical meeting in a little library like in the old days. Remember them?
Gotcha.
I know you guys have got, this beam me up technology,
Yes.
but I'm an old-fashioned doctor.
That's fine. That's fine.
I was just saying that what you're working on here is very handy for me for these talks.
Yeah.
Who was the real Jesus?
That's 7:15 in the morning, right?
PM.
Yeah.
Australia time.
Yeah, it's not on Zoom. It's just a little library meeting I do
You have to
in
fly to
Melbourne, Australia. If you have beam technology, you could beam in, I suppose.
It's
Well,
not on Zoom, no?
No,
No,
you have to
no,
fly to
no.
Australia.
Yeah, I don't run Zoom in the group. I'll have to think about trying to do it at some point.
Yeah.
So I run these meetings once a month. The Sea of Faith, if you've ever heard of it, was a thing about 40 years ago. You can Don Cupid's wrote a book, and the BBC did a series called The Sea of Faith, which you can find on YouTube. And you might be quite interested if you're interested in the philosophers of the last few centuries and the question of faith. It's all this. It's all about the last 500 years. You know, this is Nietzsche's question essentially. What's going to happen? 500 years ago, everybody was, saying Hail Mary. Now that's all out the window. What is going to be the story? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, let's drop a couple more things here. By the way, in case anybody didn't notice, I've been pointing people at the Early Christian Writings website. If you scroll down to the very bottom of his main page, you'll see a link to his Early Jewish Writings website, where he does the same thing more or less for the Tanakh. And some of the links that I've provided in the chat, especially under Book of Wisdom, Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and so on, they are links not to the Early Christian Writings website, but to the Early Jewish Writings website. So another piece of fun to explore in our attempts to understand, where all this came from and what do we know about it. So next up, the preaching of Peter, as quotes from what used to be called the preaching of Peter, which is another sayings collection, Jesus's sayings, that is only preserved in the writings in the 2nd century of Clement of Alexandria. There's a link to introduce you to it. It's another source, and I cite it here partly because it is a source that John Dominic Crossan, when he wrote In Fragments, the aphorisms of Jesus, he draws on that as probably an authentic source of sayings of Jesus, even though it's later than some of the others that we've quoted. Crossan believes, and any of us who spend time with any of these things, you notice the flavor or feel of the original speaker coming through sometimes. It's part of what's so troublesome about the Gospel of Thomas being excluded is, on the one hand, as Stephen gave us a couple examples, there are lines in Thomas that we know very well from the 4 canonical Gospels, even though Thomas predates them. And so we know if we believe that those are actual sayings of Jesus, then we have to acknowledge that some of what's in Thomas is actual sayings of Jesus. And then you compare them to other sayings side by side that are in Thomas but nowhere else, and some of those sound like the same voice. You feel like you're looking at the same speaker, using the same kinds of language to talk about his same concerns. And in some cases, it's very difficult to say, okay, this one is definitely Jesus, but that one is definitely not. You find yourself having to say, if this one is Jesus and I feel like it is, and I always thought it was, then I kind of have to think that there's stuff in Thomas that is actual sayings of Jesus, despite the fact that it was excluded from the canon, and the 4 canonical Gospels don't mention it. And it's why the whole area of studies of agrapha, graph like writing, right? Grapha, agrapha as in unwritten, the non-canonical sayings of Jesus. The conclusion one reaches the more one studies this early Christian literature and early Jewish and Greek literature is that not everything important that Jesus said ended up in the New Testament. And if you want to, we can think that it is, of course, likely that he said things that nobody wrote down. We were willing to accept that Mark and Matthew and Luke and John only wrote the things that they remembered and focused on. But it's another leap to get to the idea. Well, Stephen quotes the debate. Some people say that the Gospel of Thomas is from the 2nd century AD. The people who say that are the ones who say it's a Gnostic work. And the Gnostics were active in the 2nd century. And therefore, Thomas must be from the 2nd century. But as Harold Bloom, literary critic, I said last time, says, when he compares genuine Gnostic writings like the writings of Valentinus to Thomas, most of what the Gnostics care about is missing from Thomas. There's a little overlap, but it might be pre-Gnostic ideas that were imported into Gnosticism. And if that's true, then the later dating doesn't hold up. You will find that when people who really want to defend the canon purport to engage in literary criticism of these extra canonical writings, their thumb presses hard on the scale, always in the direction of trying to make the things that were excluded later to justify excluding them. Because if they were early, it's really hard to justify excluding them. The position that I take is, to err is human. There's no reason at all to think that the people who formed the canon did a perfect job. I mean, there's no empirical reason or philosophical reason to expect that the people who selected what went into the canon did a perfect job. There's got to be some things out of the canon that should have been in it, and there's going to be some things in the canon that should have been out of it. That's what happens when human beings do things. We don't get it all right. So I'm with Harold Bloom. I don't buy the second century dating of the Gospel of Thomas. There might be a few passages here and there, but the work itself, it smells very much like the early Jesus. And it certainly, if you compare what's in Q, which we know is first century, to what's in Thomas, there's an it's the same voice most of the time. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, really quickly. So I'm going to go a little meta here for a moment and maybe just ask a question, because one of the things is that you're identifying is all the interrelationships between these stories, right? And how they build off of one another, and how where are there contradictions, and where the inconsistencies, but you can kind of see that there's a certain consistency when it comes to how to treat each other to some degree. Discounting maybe what the translations may have been, one particular moment in time, because that can get kind of complicated. So these are ideas of kind of the wisdom traditions and mythos culture. So how is that lost in modernity? In other words, because now we're kind of getting to the point to, all right, you're seeing a consistent narrative of some sort. What is leading to the fragmentation that exists today? So that, you can kind of see where, there's a cultural narrative that's being established. Now, the culture, can be defined in different ways. But I'm saying it as far as not within the tribal sense, but within a more of a general sense. That how does this kind of differ from modernity? Because I see it as something as where now the narratives, there are so many different narratives and versions of truth that, and that they cancel each other out in a way, because they become absolutist and dogmatic in the process, right? So the idea of, the rational mind may not always appreciate what mythos has to offer, and so things along those lines, and that's how I'm thinking about it, is that where do you see kind of this fragmentation, manifesting itself today?
But see, we're going to do a whole 2 years on modernity.
Yeah, right. I'm just skipping ahead a little bit here. I'm trying to get the cheat sheet.
Yeah, I mean, it is the defining boundary between the medieval world and the modern world is that fragmentation.
Right.
And it's ostensibly at a theological level, it's driven by corruption. The just unacceptable, unsolvable corruption of the late medieval church left people no solution except to break away from it. They had to schism. And in the course of schisming, that just opens Pandora's box. For 1,000 years, they've been trying and trying and trying and trying to create one true version of Christianity. And there was all kinds of pressure building up over that 1,000-year period of people who didn't really agree with the one true version, but they'd learned to keep quiet about it. So the moment it becomes acceptable to talk about, it's just like when the Soviet Union lost its grip on Eastern Europe, and all of those nations that we had all learned were nations turn out to be artificial constructions full of people who didn't want to be together. They've been
Mhm.
forced together for all this time. The second the pressure comes off, they start blowing apart and splitting into the what were the more natural boundaries that had always been there within the populations, but that the kind of dominating political power wouldn't let them express. And that's the same thing that happens in the modern world. On the boundary from medieval to modern, all of these pent up, 1,000 years of pressure, to break apart and split apart into a, like a prism passing, splitting a white light into a rainbow. It's into a spectrum. It, there are reasons why we have some of these disagreements. There
Mhm.
are multiple possible interpretations, and not everybody's going to agree about which one's the right one. And they certainly aren't going to want to be pressured into pretending that they believe something they don't. So, given the opportunity, they're going to disagree with each other and say, "Fine, you take the high road, I'll take the low road. We'll see if we meet in Tipperary." But either way, we're each doing our bit to try to be true to this thing. It's one of the things that's interesting about Hinduism, and Stephen put a joking thing in about the yoga tradition. The Western version of yoga is, of course, totally different from the Hindu version of yoga. In Hinduism, yoga is a whole range of possible disciplines, and they take a lot of different approaches. And there is this idea that
Yeah,
there isn't one right way,
that's right.
because the
That,
cosmos is infinite and we're finite, and there's no way to
yeah,
map that onto this. And so you have to allow people to represent things in different ways. As long as we're working on climbing the same mountain, we've got to be able to take different paths to get there. So I mean, I think that sort of fundamentally underlies the philosophy of Protestantism, which is it's better if people, or it's at least the stated intent of Protestant. It is better if people try to be as authentically spiritual as they can, rather than going through the empty forms and not believing them, being forced to go through the empty forms by some outside power. And naturally, that's going to lead to diversity.
yeah. I like the example that you actually use there, though, with Hinduism, how there's actually multiple ways to the center, so to speak. Bhakti yoga, the different, the four different yogas. And so there is that, and so that's but it's still in a way. I think that because I was reading a little bit about Postman recently, and his theories on basically technology in a sense, and Isaiah Berlin as well, and how there is this lack of a shared narrative, like that there's like a scientific narrative that is much more in line with the kind of rationalist perspective, and that it's become almost like absolutist in its own right. And so that there's this kind of fragmentation that you start to see, that emerges out of this, and that fragmentation, kind of leads to certain types of conflict within it, and so, and part of that is not really appreciating what can be recaptured from the ancients. And that's where I think that modernity really kind of goes wrong, is that it doesn't, and that's what, in a way, we're doing here, is kind of recapturing what the ancients, had told us. So anyway, I don't know. That's just a thought.
Yeah, yeah. It's the question you're raising is one we'll be talking about for the next 3 years.
Yeah,
Because
sorry about that. Yeah.
as we move towards the end of the medieval period and into the modern period, your question is one of the top three questions that shapes the end of the epoch and the rise of the new one. Yeah, it's
Thank
it's
you.
just I can't do justice to it in 5 minutes.
In two sentences. Yeah, no, I didn't think
Sorry,
you could.
my gifts of compression are fall far.
I was going to say, simplicity is a gift, but so it's, but no, that's a little too much.
Yeah, that's more than I can manage. Thanks, Joe. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to say very quickly, as we're having this discussion here, and we're having a discussion about the variation and the authenticity of the doctrine as we try to implement it in the Middle Ages. And I want to say that any tradition, any oral tradition has got significant variation. When you look at even the way history itself is represented, there's tremendous, I think they call it revisionism in history. And that interpretation sometimes come down to policymaking, the way different people see things, and hence this is the way we're going to live because that's the way it is. But I think in answer to Joe's question as to where do we see the fragmentation in today's Christianity, it's interdenominationally, all the Protestant denominations, and intra denomination. And I can give you an example. The Pope is now telling the Catholic Church that it's time they leave the philosophy of Donald Trump alone on immigration and come back to the one that Jesus told you, where you love your neighbor as yourself. And he's given a big edict, and all the cardinals are getting up and saying, yes, we agree with the Pope. But when it was politically viable for them to do otherwise, because they wanted abortion, they did. And so what Rick is describing here, this, I hate to say a lack of authenticity, but variation is still present in today's world.
Yeah. Yeah. These are really tricky issues. It was the statement by the Pope that you're quoting caught my eye too. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. The Pope stepping right into the middle of US politics. This is one of the biggest divisions we have is this issue on immigration. And he was basically crystal clear. He said Jesus does not vacillate on this question. So, the pointiest part of what he said, he never had to say out loud, which is, if you're persecuting immigrants, you're unchristian. You're not a follower of Jesus. So maybe consider coming back and doing what Jesus said.
That's right. And he undermined the whole movement too. And this is a bit of a diversion. He said you can't be pro-life if you believe in the death penalty. Really? You can't be pro-life if you're starving people. You can't be pro-life if you're persecuting immigrants. What are you doing?
Yeah.
So I think this example just fits right in to the diversity of opinion as it comes to the way people honor the faith leader.
That's right. Yeah, this guy might be different from Francis, but they were good friends, and you can sure see it in the way he's stirring up trouble. It's good trouble, as was it Joe Lewis? Can't remember John Lewis who used to say that. Anyway, let's do the last of these, and then we'll go back to Kenneth. The last of these, and I don't mean the least, the Islamic Agrapha, which I had never heard of before this week. The Sufi sayings of Jesus. Now, I knew that Islam reveres Jesus. They revere all the prophets of the Lord. They just, and they're very clear on who they think is on that list of prophets. And Jesus is right there. He's right there as one of the people whose words you revere. I don't know why it never occurred. And I knew that there were at least some statements about what Jesus did in his life in Islam. I knew that much. I don't know why it never occurred to me that, given that reverence, Islam would collect sayings of Jesus, just like the Christians did. Of course, they have their own collections of sayings of Jesus. The Sufis have a bunch of them. And evidently, this arose very early on in Islam from interaction with like Syrian Christians. Right? The Syrian Christians were among the ones who were very scholarly and were copying down all the Roman and Greek, works and keeping them from being lost. This is where the transmission into the world of Islam happens, and eventually Islam sets up the houses of wisdom to keep copying and prevent from being lost these ancient Greek and Roman works. I knew that part of it, but it had never occurred to me that the Syrian Christians would have saying traditions that didn't show up in Thomas or anywhere else, but that got transmitted to the Muslims who interacted with them, and then the Muslims wrote them down. And so this falls under the category of Agrapha. It's not part of the canon, but there's reasonably good reason to think that these could be authentic sayings of Jesus that we don't have testified to anywhere else except in these Sufi sayings. So I put a link there to the main book on this by Tarif Khalidi, the Muslim Jesus, Sayings and Stories of Islamic Literature. And anyone else who wants to follow up, you can go, and I will eventually, grab yourself a copy of that book and flip through and see what the Sufis have to say about what they think Jesus said. And I'm betting that in there we will find a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar, but most of which probably has that same voice to it that we see in the preaching of Peter and the Q source and the Gospel of Thomas and these other places. Sharon, go ahead.
Can I just say one very quick thing, though? Islam has always interested me, not as a belief, but the fact that we share Christianity shares prophets with Islam. And one of the prophets they share is Jesus. I mean, I'm looking it up now. The rest of them are Abraham, Moses, Noah, and Jesus. And I've had friends who've Muslims, and we've had discussions about faith, about religion. The essence of both faiths are eerily similar. It's just the rituals that are different. And I mean, Ari, I don't know if Ari is here today, but I mean, like, Muslim women cover their head. Really Orthodox Jewish women cover their heads and wear long skirts.
And so did early Christians.
Yes, and in the early Christians, before you went to church, you had to wear a hat or a mantilla. Remember those things? So there is more similarity than diversity among all these created divisions, right? And there's also a lot of differences, inaccuracies about the recording of the life of the prophets. I mean, the story of Noah and the flood is told in many different ways, just depending on what doctrine you read. And I think we see that coming over to Jesus.
Yes.
Before I go, though, because I have to leave early today, I'm sorry about that. My favorite verse from Thomas was number 47, where he says, opposite cannot coexist. And that was the theme that Kenneth Smith used when you say you can't put new wines into old skin. I found that pretty cool.
Nice. Nice. He was quoting Thomas in the title.
Yes.
Thank you for drawing our attention to that.
I found that pretty cool.
That's a great example.
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry you can't stay for the rest. I understand.
Yes.
We're gonna dive into Kenneth now, just as you're leaving. but you've already pointed the way by showing the relevance of the Thomas discussion to Kenneth's writing. Thank you, Sharon. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, see, reference to Zulu Dawn was a movie from 1979. And this brings up the point, about the beam in your own eyes. Now, the movie's about the British have decided to move into the Zulu territory to spread the Enlightenment. Of course, the film makes, of course, it's a serious drama, but of course, there's the hidden comedy of it that, the British commanders convinced, oh, well, these Zulus, after all they've got is spears. Like, look what we got. Cannons, rifles, and you got the what was the name of that Greek woman who kept on prophesying, but Cassandra. You had the Cassandra saying, "I know these Zulus. These are tough. They're not. It's not going to be as easy as you think it is." And the army's coming up to a hill, and somebody sings out from the hill. One of the Zulus. Why do you come to the land of the Zulus? And they hunt the guy down and they kill him. And the guy turns around to the Cassandra and said, look, these Zulus aren't so tough. And he said, that's just an old man. But nobody would believe the Cassandra. So they end up in the wrong spot. Things don't go down too well. But this is it. Why I'm critical of Popper and his open society is, well, yeah, it's like us criticizing the Russians. I'll give you maybe the Russians are everything that's bad and Putin's everything that's bad. But you got to look at yourselves. Oh, we're the West. We're the enlightened ones. We're going to spread love and, kisses and enlightenment. Have you ever looked at yourselves? I mean, if some aliens came along in a flying saucer, as far as they're concerned, you Westerners are just as bad as the Russians. And they'll wipe you out and say, oh, we got rid of those bad guys there. People don't seem to understand that. So this is a problem. I could tell you that maybe you're right. Maybe the Russians and Putin are everything that's bad. That's an essentialist argument. This is where I learned what the existentialism was about. Yeah, that's an essentialist argument, but existence precedes essence. If the Russians are bad, all right, yeah, that's an essentialist, but they exist. You're going to have to deal with an existence.
Yes.
And years ago, you think about Napoleon and Hitler trying to invade Russia. And I was thinking in 1990, nobody would be ever stupid enough to try that again. And yet, of course, the West is saying that they're the good guys. And there's a partial truth to that.
Not really.
And the Russians are the bad guys, and there's a partial truth to that, but it's not quite that simple.
No.
And now the Europeans obviously thought, well, we will just sweep the Russians out of the way and everything will go our way and everything will be sweet. And it's not working out. And you can see the European leaders are starting to panic. The best laid plans of mice and men seldom go astray, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
I just want to say one thing because Stephen started talking about the beam in your own eye. Thomas talked about that too. Thomas saying number 26, where he talked about the speck and the beam. And you just said you have to deal with the essence. And the way you say you deal with the essence is you use judgment and forgiveness. That's what the interpretation of the beam and the eye is. And that's what you started talking about. It's Gospel of Thomas saying 26. I had a lot of fun reading through this, actually.
Well, before you criticize the other guy, or as you criticize the other guy,
yes,
look in the mirror.
That's right. That's very true.
Yes.
And Jesus said that too.
Yes.
When the widow came to the church and gave the mite, and they said, look, that's all she's given. Jesus said, well, that's all she has.
Right. She gave everything. Now, how about you give everything?
Yes. So it's just, which is why I enjoy this so much. It's just dynamic. This is the way I see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love doing these explorations together.
Although it gets a bit more rugged if you're getting into Heinlein and the Stranger in a Strange Land. And the Martians, who were so greatly evolved, unfortunately, they had to destroy, what was it, the fourth planet. But we sing songs about them all, what wonderful guys they were, but we had to destroy them. They were a bit troublesome. But they didn't actually demonize their opponents.
No.
They just had to destroy them. Unfortunately, it was an unfortunate necessity. But we demonize other people.
Yes. It's a hilarious passage designed to critique the way that we deal with our opponents. It's like, yeah, these guys too could be violent, but when they were violent, they were enlightened about it. We had to destroy them, but it's not that they were evil. It was just unfortunate. They had to go. All right, well, let's go back to Kenneth. This ends our section on Thomas and the Agrapha for today. And I just knew it would take all this time just to lay out all of the links and all the references and all the books so that people can explore at their leisure and see what an enormous wealth of sources there is on this wisdom sayings literature and how much of it predates Jesus. Joe, you wanted to add something?
No, just recently, really quickly, as far as even the idea of looking at somebody else, as being part of you, and having that their behavior is actually that you may be condoning, or not. I mean, in the sense that condemning, I should say, is that that essentially is in you, and kind of seeing the person that's actually in, your relationship to the other person, as I was saying a little bit earlier. But even the idea of when you're conquering somebody, the whole idea of conquering somebody, the idea of mercy is actually what brings harmony. And so kind of seeing that, even the idea of war and conflict within that, that when you've conquered somebody, it's not about conquering somebody. It's about the idea that the only way harmony is restored is through mercy. And through mercy is actually restored through kind of seeing the other person. And this is where a lot of the conceptual ideas of seeing the God in the other person, or seeing the inherent worth in the other person. And this is kind of this ethical aspect of it as well that also comes into play. But it's an essential part of harmony. I mean, just it is, because conflict does arise, but it's in how do you establish, make sure conflict doesn't happen again. It's only
So the Hindus call it namaste. I behold the light in you. And that's the greeting. That's what that is. And Jesus teaches that too. I behold the light in you. Namaste. That's what it means.
Thank you both. And with that, we're diving back into Kenneth. And so the reason for this setup, of course, is so that we could have the experience of exploring other stuff, but also to give us more context for what had Kenneth read and what did he know about when he was writing the paragraph that we're just diving into, is, in fact, this whole chapter. So we did the first two sentences last week. I'm only going to drop them in here and recite them just so that to get the continuity into the rest of the paragraph. He starts out, the truth of spirit is that the life people see is ultimately a field of meanings they themselves have created for themselves, spawned unwittingly from within. And so this is his statement on how character, our individual character, affects what we can and cannot notice when we look at the world or look at other people or look at ourselves. We don't see the whole picture. We take the infinite panorama in front of us, and our character unconsciously does a selection to decide what our conscious mind is going to notice and think about. And the mistake, the terrible mistake, is if we come to believe that selection and filtering never took place. We come to believe that the way that we imagine something is the way that it truly is. We mistake the model for the reality, and then we insist on imposing upon reality choices and behaviors that would only make sense if reality was the way we imagine it, not the way it really is. And so this is what he's getting into, and he's about to talk about it in the context of what do people think Jesus said? What do they think the message is? What do they think the point of Christianity is? He continues in sentence 2. That is the degree and form of creation that finite spirit is capable of, which leaves us ultimately the chief subjects of our own unthought about authority, which is a great turn of phrase, right? This is his restatement of ethos anthropoi daimon. If our character is like a god over us and we are subject to its authority, then Kenneth is here saying, yeah, we are not sovereigns, we are subjects. And our sovereign is our unconscious character that decides what we care about and what we notice. We're not actually in charge. Unless we cultivate our character, we're not in charge. Even after we cultivate our character, we're still not in charge, but we're just being ruled by something. Maybe it's better or healthier or wiser than it was before we cultivated it. Maybe we can do anthropoculture and cultivate our character into a better sovereign over us. But either way, we're going to remain subjects. He says, and which leaves most humans the conformist victims of the relative unoriginality of their own constructed inner world. And this is hi Sharon, great to see you this week. this is the recurring theme that Kenneth talks about. He quotes many different people on, which is this idea that we imagine that the part of us that is the most truly unique and individual and us is our mind and our heart, what's inside of us. But if you actually study where people get their ideas and feelings and behavior, as Oscar Wilde says, it's almost all through imitation and mimesis. Wilde says most people are other people. Everything about them is a quotation or an imitation. It's not the authentic self. When you see the enormous amount of work that's done in the modern world to format human beings to mass produce us as generic people who think the same things while imagining that we're all different. You know, it puts you in light of that moment in Monty Python and the Life of Brian, when Brian is saying, you don't have to follow me, you don't have to follow anyone. You're all individuals. And the entire crowd as one goes, right, we're all individuals. It was the least individual thing they could possibly have said. And of course, the extra joke is the one guy at the back of the crowd who goes, I'm not. Guy next to him goes, shh. It's like the only original person in the crowd is the one who thinks he's not original. So, you know, all of this is getting at things that many philosophers and writers have talked about, which is our inner world is a lot less original than we think it is. It's a hodgepodge of Xerox copies of other stuff that our unconscious has then worked to rationalize and fit together. And it rationalizes either by compartmentalizing things inside us that are completely incompatible and preventing us from ever putting them together and noticing we have a problem, or by warping them both to fit each other in some fashion, thereby distorting both of them. And this is what goes on in our dreams. This is what goes on during our waking moments. When our conscious mind is thinking about one thing, our unconscious mind is back there in the back, weaving and weaving and warping and weaving to make things fit. This is a world that we have constructed and that then we project upon the planet as a Rorschach test. And the projection is a mosaic of unoriginal things. But we think it's original. And we don't even think that it's binding on us. We think our conscious mind is seeing the world the way it actually is, and that we're with a godlike fidelity. We think it's our birthright to be objective. And then we assume that all of the things that we choose to prioritize, the decisions that we make, we assume all of this is good, high quality judgment about the world, and that our actions are good, high quality choices about the world, when the whole thing is warped and highly unoriginal. Donald, you had your hand up. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Oops, I accidentally muted you again. You got to unmute yourself again.
Sorry. I just think that victims of the relative unoriginality of their own constructed inner world is one of the best phrases that Kenneth has written. You know, and additionally here, how that Greek finite spirit is contained within true Christian infinite spirit. It is an extension of the knowing of oneself. And so in that dialectic progression, the truths that the Greek world came up with remain in true Christianity, I think, if we had it, or had it not been strangled in the cradle or whatever happened to it. But so I think that, yeah, this is a very good paragraph. I'll let you talk more about it.
I'm just dropping in Thomas 3 here, which we talked about last week, to underscore what you just said, which is here's Thomas 3. When you know yourselves, gnothise auton, then you will be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and you are poverty. You can see in these sayings collections, and it's the same in Q, you can see the Greek finite spirit and its wisdom literature being extended into the new worldview.
You know, I think in terms of just the scheme of existentialism that infinite spirit, or the infinity of spirit, kind of just has to be that the Greeks missed something in knowing themselves, and there was something else to find. If it's a bolt from the blue, it's not existential. It has to be something that we found within ourselves. Otherwise, we've become, what was he say? Escapist. We're not. So schematically, it kind of has to work. But how it worked this way, I had no clue.
Yeah.
And Kenneth is going through here very carefully, I think, showing the sort of dialectic progression that gets you from one to the other, and then it's also its deformities.
Yes. He's mapping a revolution in a way that slows down the explosion and lets us see where everything came from. It's like one of those diagrams in which all the parts of the engine are blown out, but the lines lead back to where they were connected to each other. And you go, oh, that's how it all fits together. You're right. That's what he's trying to do here. And, there's been a lot of commentary on the way that the early Christians considered themselves an extension of Judaism. They said to the Jews, you don't understand your own literature, you don't understand your own God, so we are taking it over, and we are the real Jews. We are the real chosen people because we're the only ones who understand what your Messiah is and what your text is and what your God is. He's our Messiah, he's our text, our God. Regardless of whether you agree with them or not, they were very blunt about the fact that that was their perspective. They talked about it a lot. But kind of what this retrospective on the Agrapha does, and what you just underscored, Kenneth is doing, is he's also showing how the same could be said about their relationship to the Hellenic world, to the Greek world. That they're saying you had a concept of spirit and nature, and they were important, but you were missing something. And we see what it is that you're missing, and we are adding that to our theology and our ontology and our cosmology in order to correct you. And now we're the real Greeks, right?
How Hegelian.
It is, right?
It's yeah. That well, it was. What's the word? Where things are subsumed. The past gets and the truth gets carried forward.
Yes.
Instead of being forgotten or discarded.
Yes. Yes. It gives me a lot of, you don't have to agree with the early Christians about any of this to appreciate what they're doing, what they think they're doing, what they're trying to do. And you can see how in a time of intense corruption under the late Roman Empire, this is a viable strategy. If you're trying to come up with a new worldview and a new value system that will get you out of that morass of corruption, this is a totally legitimate approach. Now, whether we think they did it correctly or not is a whole separate question. But as a strategy, saying we want to find the best parts of what is and build on that in a new direction to something that has not been yet. That's kind of what anybody has to do in what we have to do in the circumstances we find ourselves in.
So the Roman Church did to Christianity what the Roman Empire did to the Greek culture.
Yes, yes, yes. Which is why Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman have a similar kind of poison to them as statements. It's like, who are the Romans to claim to be Greco-Romans? You guys did not totally understand the Greeks that you claim to have subsumed. And then you can ask about the Judeo-Christian. You could say, do Christians really understand Judaism as well as they think they do? When they read the quote Old Testament, do they actually understand the Tanakh as deeply as a Jew does? Or are they reading into it their perspective? It's I disassembling these things and saying there's the Greeks and then there's the Romans, there's the Jews and then there's the Christians, and we learn a lot by disentangling them from each other and seeing where they are their own authentic selves, not serving an ideological function as merely being the predecessors to the one true successor. All right, so let's continue on, and that's as far as we got, by the way, last time in paragraph 13. Let's move on in paragraph 13 to the rest of it. He continues, is not such a dilemma of self-subjection, was what we were talking about, ultimately incompatible with the very notion of salvation from without? Right? I mean, if you're being trapped by your own unconscious, how does somebody coming along and claiming that they're going to save you deal with that fundamental problem? You don't, what you need might not be a get out of hell ticket. You might need a clue, to turn and look at your own damn unconscious and understand what your character is, right? In AA, the very first rule of AA, you have to accept that there's something in you that you don't have power over. It has power over you. This is what he was talking about in sentences 1 and 2. That there is this thing, this authority at work. And according to ancient Greek polytheism, that means your hope for the future has to consist in part in learning what that authority is and how it behaves. That's how you overcome your alcoholism. You say, I see that it's in me and I can't get rid of it, and it is an incredible power over me. But I'm going to work to not trust that power and to work around it. And the way I do that is to never for a second forget that I have this problem. And so in sentence 3, Kenneth is saying, if you are to be saved from the obscure but terrible authority of your own unconscious character, wouldn't the only way forward involve having to turn and face it and deal with it, just like an alcoholic deals with his own alcoholism? Can you really be saved from without? Can someone just come along and save you? How much luck? I mean, I come from a family full of drug addicts and alcoholics and mentally ill people, so I know I can, even though I've never practiced the bottle, I know without a doubt that I'm an alcoholic. Every adult member of my family for generations on both sides will spend a significant amount of time in the bottle, some of them right up until their death. So that's a test I don't have to run. So I know there is this authority over me. And the only reason why the bottle doesn't rule my life is because I recognize that it has the power to. So what he's talking about in sentence 3 is, one of the things I do not have the power to do is to stop anybody else in my family from being an alcoholic or a drug addict. I have zero power to make somebody else not choose the bottle or the pills or what have you. And anybody who's dealt with addiction and addictive family members will come to recognize this. The only way out is for the person themselves to take responsibility for that part of themselves they're in denial about. Because as long as they're in denial, it rules them. They have to see the shackles. And this goes back to from years ago, Stephen's thing about what is it that's shackling Fenris? What are these invisible chains? And of course it is the invisible chains that you can't break because you're in denial that they're even there. You don't perceive them. You think it's not happening. So this is what he's raising here. And of course, this all sets up sentence 4. But before we get there, we have a cue. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to just chime in on what you just said, real quick, Rick.
Okay.
I was
Yeah.
just thinking about one of my girlfriends from many years ago, who just was so she just felt like she just could not. The reason I'm the way I am is because my parents were so abusive. My parents were so abusive, and it's like I wish she could just hear what you just said here in this meeting. You gotta somehow help yourself. You gotta find a way to heal yourself. So I was just thinking about her as I'm listening to you, Rick. That's all. Okay.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the hard one. It's the hard one wisdom that drop by drop is distilled from pain is the only way we get to these epiphanies. It's like the man with the anger management problem who blames everybody for making him angry. You made me hit you. I don't want to hit anybody, but you made me do it. This is a person who has not acknowledged that there is a separation between stimulus and response. And in that separation is his duty and responsibility to manage his own feelings, to acknowledge that his anger doesn't come from the other person. It comes from inside himself. He felt the anger. The other person didn't inflict it upon him. And so he has the responsibility to decide how he's going to respond when he feels this thing. It's like the bull that always charges the color red, which is a myth, but it's a powerful myth, right? The bull has to acknowledge that just because he sees red doesn't mean he has to run. He could just go, okay, I see red. I know what I'd like to do, but I'm in a China shop. It might be a bad idea for me to do this. This is a really hard lesson for us because we are taught in the modern world that we're supposed to be all good. And that means all the bad things in us, we have to blame on somebody else. And it's an easy solution that doesn't solve anything. It leaves us trapped, right? Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think even to Jenny's point, it is actually interesting. Our ability to respond is based off of the idea that we're not looking at externally, basically at the individuals, whether it be our parents, whatever it may be. But the one thing I would like to find, explore a little bit more deeply is this, we can look at it in terms of this model of like self-harm so far as the physical aspect of it within alcoholism or something like that. And that's clear, right? That, that this is the feedback is, this is not good. And so, unless you're really just like being an alcoholic, I mean, in which case, I don't teach his own. But it becomes a whole lot more difficult when you're, this element of self-awareness needs to be within the context of the social, the society that you're in. And what I mean by that is that you have to almost develop an identity. Because you have to so say you live in a completely unjust society, and you're talking about the character of the individual, and that's the idea of being harmed, right? That's how you're harming yourself. That then it would take a high degree of self-awareness and the ability to kind of step out of cultural norms, and then to challenge those cultural norms within that context. And so that's your identity, right? But that's a really high degree of awareness that we're talking about. Because when it's not so obvious, when the feedback isn't that, oh, I'm an alcoholic and this is not good, it's when it's a little bit more subtle is the real challenge, is that, that's when it becomes like, well, you have to do the real deep introspection as to, well, maybe I shouldn't be beating this person because they didn't work. I mean, something like that. It's you're stepping out of the societal norms. And I think that's a high degree of awareness. So the point I was trying to make more than anything else is that the idea of identity is key in that process, because you're almost rewriting the narrative, the cultural narrative, to relate it back to what we were talking about before. And you're doing it in a way that's good for you, and good in this context would be character. So if you think about it from that perspective, there are very few people that can actually pull that off. However, it also highlights the importance of really challenging ourselves and kind of looking not only within the circumstances that, well, the example Jenny gave, the person is born into, but also the society the individual is born into, and to not necessarily, and to take responsibility for that and respond in a way that's actually then, then at least your own, to some degree, to whatever degree that's possible.
Yeah.
It's like when it's not so obvious, it's hard.
It's hard. It is among the hardest things for us in exactly the same way. I mean, like AA has an enormous failure rate. We don't talk about it very much, but it has an enormous failure rate. So a lot of people can't grasp the idea that their own, and this is where I'm going to use some Joe terminology, their own agency is so contaminated by contingency. They can't. This is what Heraclitus tries to teach us, but moderns are not in a position to recognize that there's not just the lawful binding authoritative nature around us. There's a lawful binding authoritative nature within us as well, and it doesn't do what we want. It does what its own lawfulness dictates. And if that law says, you know, Donald can have a drink from a bottle and it's not a problem, but if Rick has a drink from a bottle, all is lost. You know, you that's something Rick needs to know. Rick needs to know this about himself. Just like you have to know you can't jump off the roof just because you can imagine it without breaking your leg. You know, how many teenagers they don't understand the lawfulness of the nature around them and they make that mistake. So it's natural because at least the nature around us is visible on the surface. We can at least see the roof and the ground, and it helps a lot in visualizing. And a certain number of kids will look at that gap and feel fear and go, I'm sorry, buddy. I don't care what you dare me. I am not jumping off that roof. I have a bad feeling. And that comes from the ability to visualize the thing clearly, even if we don't understand everything that's happening. And the problem with the nature within us is it's invisible. We can't see it. I mean, we have our hands tied behind our back when it comes to learning the same lessons about the lawfulness of our character that we so with such great difficulty learn about the lawfulness of the world around us. It is a tough situation to be in. And so, you know, you need, this is what the ancient Hellenic perspective is, that you need a wisdom literature that gives you example after example after example of showing how agency and contingency are intertwined with each other, and that shows examples of people doing it wrong and suffering the consequences, and shows examples of people doing it right, and what can be possible for us if we do it right. And then you got to make sure that this is part of your canon. Everybody grows up with this. Nobody misses it because this is something this is the fundamental problem everybody has, whether they like it or not. That, you know, and if they don't like it, if they don't know it, if they don't study it, they're fucked. You know, they're just like everything else they try to do is going to be contaminated by this problem that they're not aware of. They don't know who or what they are. They failed at the very first question, Gnothi se auton. It's and from there on, it's just a sequence of unintended consequences for the rest of their life. This is the Hellenic perspective in a nutshell about human nature and that challenge of the human condition. And all of this, Kenneth is assuming in the critique he's giving about the difficulty that would-be Christians have when they're faced with the example of Jesus. Are they in a position to understand what he's asking them to do? And after I call on Stephen, I'll take us into sentence 4, where Kenneth's going to get into this question of what does salvation mean to somebody who can take authority for their own character versus what does it mean to somebody who cannot, who doesn't believe that anything is their fault, that everything is extrinsic. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So the idea that one of my all my ancestry are alcoholics, so I have to be one as well. This is a common thing in the world, is the idea, you know, my ancestors are all violent hooligans, so I have to be one myself. There's a partial truth in that, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to overcome the tendencies.
Exactly.
And what we're seeing a lot of going around in the world today is saying, oh, no, you yourself inwardly cannot overcome your tendencies. We'll give you a pill for it. You need a pill. You can't do it. Only the pill will save you. Now, why I'm saying this, I'll ask you a question, Rick. A lot of people said of Goethe that, oh, he's the most well-rounded, calm, all the, good qualities one can imagine. But some say Goethe, when they were comparing the idea of IQs, how valid that is. We argue about it now, but some have thought that Goethe had an IQ somewhere about 240. But anyway, the trouble with people with high IQs is they have enormous inner sensitivities. You know, people say, well, you know, having an IQ of 75 must be a disadvantage. If you're going to be a librarian, yes, but for a lot of things in life, no, it's actually an advantage because you're not being overwhelmed by your inner sensitivities. You're seeing reality as it is. Now, when people said, oh, you know, Goethe, he's such a well-balanced, calm sort of guy, guess what they're missing? Where he started. When Goethe was a youngster, he was, you know, whether there's such a thing as really a schizo, he was out there. He was up the creek without a paddle. And he figured that out. And he figured, how am I going to be able to cope with my inner sensitivities and all these things that are working on me? And he developed a way of mind to deal with it. And that's what's implicit in Goethe's work, is the idea that education can overcome our tendencies.
Yes.
You know, this comes through Schopenhauer, or you got, you know, like Rudolf Steiner's educational theory is pretty much from Goethe, that there's an inner being that has that is molded. We live in a society which has become obsessed with the externals, and for good reason. You know, all the wonderful technology and blah, blah, blah and stuff that we've got now are all externals. But Goethe saw the danger in that. He was living in the world where, you know, the Newtonian view of the world had already been dominating for a couple of generations. And yeah, sure, it was great, but there's an enormous downside there. And the enormous downside is that they were looking on externals and forgetting the inner man, forgetting culture. And so Goethe was the romantic reactionary to that. And we're still in that fight today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's exactly what you're saying is exactly right on. It's core to the Hellenic worldview that they believe in the possibility of anthropoculture. You know, they believe that education can make a tremendous difference in how somebody turns out, and it's because they recognize that, you know, man is a cultural animal, that we are not locked in when we're born to one outcome, not in the way that a cheetah is more locked in than we are. We have a greater variability. We're born as a generic animal, and our process of maturation turns us away from being a generic animal into becoming a specific animal. And that's the part in the modern world we don't understand very well. We think we remain infinitely adaptable even as adults, and we're not. But that process of metamorphosis and transformation that the infant goes through to become the adult is a realm in which there is enormous, like Stephen is saying, there is enormous potential to transform and to things that loom large in you when you're born can be made small, and things that are small in you when you're born can be made large. You can change the balance of your character, and as a result, you know, it's incumbent upon us as a culture, if we're going to have a culture, to be a culture is to deliberately do anthropoculture. You know, to you know, resource ourselves to change for the better, as Donna says in the text. So in my case, when it comes to the alcoholism, you know, Stephen's right on. I'm almost certainly born with it. I mean, we believe it's genetic. You know, you have the gene or you don't have the gene. And if you don't have the gene, no problem. The odds of you becoming an alcoholic are very small. It can still be done, but it's not like if you've got the gene. If you've got the gene, the odds of not becoming a practicing alcoholic are very small. And when you think about recessive genes and dominant genes and how they manifest over time, I can look back at my family and just see the numbers were against me. So, but I got educated as a adolescent when my dad finally confronted his alcoholism, and he shared with my brother and I this book by Claudia Black, which I put in the chat, called "It Will Never Happen to Me: Growing Up with Addiction as Youngsters, Adolescents, Adults," in which she talks about how does it transmit generationally, what effect does denial of it have upon guaranteeing that you become an addict. But and a big part of it was, this is where she talks about the stereotypical addictive family. Says there's a limited number of ways that a family can hold itself together in the presence of intense addiction, and the people adopt stereotypical roles. And it doesn't matter whether they're in China or if they're in El Salvador or if they're in Seattle, Washington, or what they're back, whether they're religious or irreligious, they're going to end up becoming these caricatures of themselves so that the family can function. And it was reading in this book and recognizing myself, my brother, my mother, my father, and all these people as caricatures. And we thought we were individuals. And instead, there we are being shaped by this gene in ways that Claudia Black was able to explain very clearly. It did exactly what Stephen has just said. It gave us the potential to use education and cultivation to transform our outcomes. And it didn't work for a couple of my brothers, but it did work for me. So I count myself lucky that I got to be in the 33%, and that's why we're having this seminar rather than me being.
So Rick, may I ask you, last time you had an alcoholic drink? Do you remember when was last time?
Before first grade.
You stopped first grade?
Be
So you have not drank any alcohol since you were in first grade?
No, I dare not. I dare not.
Wow. So you were aware of that when you were in first grade?
No, I lucked out when I was young. My grandma watched out for me and steered me one way or another. And then as an adolescent, I encountered this book, and that's when I was able to take over that kind of putting up the training wheels and guardrails for myself. But before I entered first grade, the kid from across the street and he got me into going to the tavern across the other street. I was on a corner, and going to the boxes out behind the tavern and getting the bottles of alcohol and sipping the little dregs or drips that were left in them.
So you actually drank some alcohol when you were in first grade?
Little drops of alcohol out of mostly empty bottles. This is not something a normal person does.
No.
And I've been able to reflect on it for the rest of my life and go,
wow.
I don't really need to test it any further than I did before I started first grade.
So when you took the drips, it didn't taste good to you then? It tasted good to you?
I mean, evidently. I remember that parents, and before that, parents would most of my uncles and aunts were alcoholics, and they try to give me cans of beer to drink and things like that. And I remember thinking it tasted awful and metallic, but my mouth watered. So on the one hand, I didn't like the flavor or the smell, but on the other hand, my body craved it. So I put those pieces together and said, I don't need to do any further tests. It's one of the things that distinguishes a normal person who can have a drink from an alcoholic, is that the alcoholic is always obsessed with doing tests to prove that they're not an alcoholic. A healthy person doesn't need to prove anything. They can just have a drink and go on with their life. It's fine. It is only alcoholics who just can't stop talking about proving that they can hold their liquor and, I'm fine. I swear I'm fine. I'm totally fine. Anyway, the point of this isn't to talk about alcoholism per se, although I'm certainly willing to, but to talk about the power that character has over our conscious mind. Because in this case, alcoholism just stands in for any other part of human character. When Heraclitus says ethos anthropoi daimon, this is what he means. That's the degree of authority our character has over us, whether for good or for ill, or for weird and askew and quirky. And this is what Kenneth is alluding to when in paragraph 13. So I'm gonna restate sentence 3, and then let's move on to the big juicy one that wraps up paragraph 13. So he starts out, is not such a dilemma of self-subjection ultimately incompatible with the very notion of salvation from without? If so, then at one and the same time, Jesus must contend with conveying a paradoxical and sublime vision for whose seed he knows most humans are culturally and personally condemned to be stony ground, but also by this very dilemma, ancient fatalism's principles trump the softer and sweeter world of the Christian cosmology, which evolved further to spread not to the stringently spiritual, but rather to those mired in pathos and emotion. So he's talking about Jesus has a tough row to hoe. I mean, forget about crucifixion. Even just in his teaching, he's got a tough row to hoe for the two reasons that Ken is talking about here. On the one hand, many people are just they're gonna lack the character. But on the other hand, if you're trying to spread a religion, you spread it better with sugar than you do with vinegar. You go around telling everybody you've got a major problem. How popular is your position going to be? You know, you're not going to find a lot of takers. And so the temptation to evangelists to water down and sweeten up the message, Jesus's teachings, and make them just good news. In the 70s, you could pick up these Bibles for free that said good news on the cover. They were the good news Bibles, and they were there to tell you the good news. And this is something that Kenneth thinks about when he's writing sentences like the ones we're seeing here. He's like, the authentic Jesus isn't here to give you good news, right? He says in Mark, he says in Thomas, he says in Q, over and over, he says, there is stony ground on which these seeds will not grow. And you know, when you come to a town where nobody's going to get it, just shake the dust of that town off your sandals. Move on. Go somewhere else. It says this message is for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. This is only for people who are going to want to hear bad news, but that there is something that they can do about it. The bad news is the bad news of our character and our situation. And the good news is that if we take up our responsibilities, that as Stephen says, we can do something about it. We can engage in difficult but possible transformation to stack the deck better in our favor. But think about the church, the early church at the time when it's thinking, how do I convince the Roman Empire to adopt me as its chief religion? How can I be as popular as possible? And of the many things Jesus said, which are they going to pick out to use as their bumper stickers and you know, little buttons on the shirt, the little cliches on the coin? What are they going to use as their elevator pitch? It's not going to be the core of Jesus's message. It's going to be this other stuff that they think is sweeter and will attract more people. And the problem is, if you draw people in for that reason, then you're drawing in people who you have prepared to resist the core of Jesus's message, the message of sacrifice and doing difficult work and pushing a boulder up a hill for the rest of your life in order to do something good. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This sentence just gives me trouble. I mean, grammatically, I feel like something's missing, but I guess I think for whose seed, the who is the vision. Seed refers back to the vision. He's casting this vision. I mean, Kenneth here is producing a parallel to Matthew, I think, story of casting the seed in some lands on stony ground, which is the people whose souls aren't prepared or character is not prepared to receive it. So the seed is the vision. Because, I mean, the human beings are the stony ground, the humans. Okay. I just kept, if you agree, that's fine.
No, I agree. You're reading it right. It's a
It's just when I read it and it like, I bumped on that, it's like, wait a minute. Did I, well, this is, it's, if that's the way you read it, then that's fine.
that's the way I
I
read
don't,
it. It's what the grammar suggests. It helps that I'm married to an editor, so and I had to before we got together today take some time on this sentence and its grammatical structure. I 100% sympathize with your difficulty here because what he's done is he's made a paragraph length or maybe book length idea be compressed into a single difficult sentence.
yeah. Sometimes when Kenneth is being pithy, I just get a lot of fruit stones stuck in my teeth.
Yeah, it's the at one and the same time. So what he's done is he's taken two different ideas that he could have taken a lot of time to explain each one individually, and instead he's focusing on the relationship between them. So he's cramming them together into the same structure. And the splice is the semicolon. So from Jesus to stony ground is the first horrible challenge that Jesus has to contend with. But after the semicolon, but also down to emotion is the second thing that Jesus has to contend with. And what's terrible, Kenneth is saying, is that either one of these would be enough to make what he's trying to do nearly impossible. But you put them together, and it's not just quantitatively hard, it's qualitatively hard what he's trying to do in his ministry. That's the assertion that Kenneth is making. So on the one hand, you have the problem of the incompatibility of his message with individual character, which is the first half of the sentence. But on the other hand, you have the incompatibility of his message with the mission to the Gentiles and spreading this religion as widely as possible, which was never part of what Jesus was doing. That's more Paul, right? Jesus is talking to who's in front of him. He's not saying everybody in the world has to listen to me. That's a Paul thing. Jesus is, so when you take Jesus's teaching, which wasn't designed to appeal to the whole world, and then you put it in the hands of people who are determined to spread it to the whole world, you have a whole separate problem from the problem of individual character being incompatible. And it creates a train wreck because it turns the first problem into a problem on steroids, right? It was bad enough when Jesus was contending with this one-on-one with individual people that he met. But the moment it's the whole world full of people, the scale of magnitude of the incompatibility just becomes a I don't know, gears stripping kind of sound. This is what Kenneth is arguing here.
You can't say it's difficult if your message is only going to be received well by a few, but your objective is to broadcast it to everyone.
Yes.
And how can you reasonably ever expect both objectives to be met?
Yes.
If it's received by everyone, then it will be distorted.
Yes.
By the deficient characters of the receivers. And if otherwise it goes to the people that you might say don't actually need it. Their character, they're already Christian enough without Jesus's teachings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's describing two Procrustean beds. And the one Procrustean bed is the individual character, but the other Procrustean bed is a church whose goal is to make everybody adopt this is a whole different kind of torture of his message because their temptation to mess with it is irresistible. They will never succeed at what
they didn't resist.
Of course.
I'll clue you in. In case you don't know the rest of the history of the world, they didn't succeed.
You've already read this book. Let me tell you what's on the last page. The church done it. in order to get his message to be approved by as many people as possible, they changed the message. That was the solution. That's what Kenneth is saying here. Is it would be hard enough if you didn't change the message, but then you have an institution whose purpose is incompatible, and therefore they had to change the message. They had to achieve what they wanted to do. You know, this is something. This is a problem the Jews don't have with their religion. It's part of why Judeo-Christian is such a terrible thing to say. The Jews don't say everybody in the world has to be a Jew. The Jews don't say we need to get everybody to follow our law. They don't for a moment think this is for everybody. And in order to make it be for everybody, let's water it down and sweeten it up. They do not think that way about their religion. Judaism and Christianity are in at least this respect fundamentally alien religions to each other.
So if you water it down and sweeten it up, it's like Kool-Aid.
Right?
You get to drink.
I had that running through my head too. My mom used to make a lot of Kool-Aid for us in high school. All right.
Thank you, Rick. You know, it's probably irrelevant, but in the decades that I've known and talked with Kenneth, I've never discussed the Christianity with him or his thoughts on well, I won't say on the church, on the modern church. He expresses things occasionally, particularly, but never the stuff covered by this chapter.
Right.
Right. And it's probably good for me to struggle.
Me
as
too.
opposed to the way I feel when we discuss the Greeks. I've discussed Greek philosophy and Greek culture and Greek society with him time after time after time for long, until I read it and I say, oh yeah, I remember we just did that and that and that and that, but this is like brand new. I've almost forgotten how hard some of this stuff is to read and how much I enjoyed those letters to the editor of the Comics Journal about.
For those who didn't read this back in the day, in the Comics Journal, they always had a letters page. And if there was an angry letter, 9 times out of 10, it was about Kenneth's column in the back. They had a whole issue they could have written about that they could have enjoyed. But boy, they get to those last 4 pages where there's one of these chapters of Kenneth's writing, and they're just fuming and erupting and writing these just enraged letters to Gary Groth going, what is this horrible stuff in the back? Why? Why would you publish this? You have to stop it. We hate you. Every so often Kenneth would respond, but normally he just chuckled.
Yeah, I used to enjoy those a lot too because of, not that they were on point. They weren't on point. It's just, in most cases, they would prove Kenneth's point. He would say that, he'd be talking some gay about the limited ability of people to think philosophically or to use ideas or something like that. And then you get these letters that exhibit every characteristic.
And they think they're refuting him.
Yeah.
It was just the bitterest humor. Like, oh, sweetie, you are a walking specimen of what he just wrote about last issue. You think that you're proving him wrong. And instead, we could use you as a text, but we'll just use you as a supplement. Anytime we read the previous installment, we'll just say, and behold, just what he was talking about. As though he scripted it himself. Here comes somebody out of the woodwork to display exactly the Banausic or Dulick incapability of comprehending these fundamental lessons. It was just, I mean, you're right. It was just, I would laugh and laugh. I learned a lot from reading those. Uh, anyway, yeah.
Okay,
I,
enough distraction from me.
I'm going to agree with you too, though, that the first time I read these back in the day, I don't think I got most of the juice out of the medieval chapters. I was more interested in the Greeks. And of course, I'm always ready to hear critiques of the modern world I'm in. But the medieval stuff, he covers, even though he takes more chapters to do it, in a way, it would take even more chapters than he wrote to properly cover the medieval period. Like we said last week, the others in the ancient we have the middle and the end, and in the modern we have the beginning and the middle. In a sense, they're shorter. There's less to say because we're missing part of the picture. The medieval would take a greater length because we've got to talk about where it came from and then what was it in its essence and in its diversity and variations in the middle period, and then how did it end and become modernity. And he doesn't do that. He instead, like in this sentence, or in this entire chapter, he sets up the argument by first discussing the transition from the ancient world to the medieval world, and then pivots from there into the corruption, the inevitable corruption of the medieval message that led to the end of the medieval period. And in doing so, he's giving us the architectural structure of European history while skipping the middle part. What was it at its best? He doesn't talk about that very much. He gives us Jesus in an admiring way. I mean, and he's following in the footsteps of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others in saying, yeah, that Jesus guy is pretty awesome. But we don't get most of the 1,000-year period of the medieval section, right? We get the ends, both ends. And he's doing it in this very chapter too. So I I the first time I came away from it with a better understanding of the revolutions going in and out of it than I did of what is medievalism in essence. And it took time, like in the letters and correspondence, the emails, it took time to gradually clue in to understand what he meant when he called the medieval world the realm of the spirit. What is this spirit? What is this soul he's talking about? That's the thing, more than anything, that's the thing it's taking me 25 years to understand in his writings, because he does have something to say about it. He has a lot to say about it, but it's often
I don't have another 25 years, Rick. If you could hurry up, it'd be appreciated.
I'm working on it.
You don't know that, Don.
You're killing me, man. Okay. Well, why don't we dive in then? Speaking of hurrying up, let's get a little more of paragraph 13 while we can. So here come sentences 5 and 6. He continues. Christianity institutionalized itself just by means of its genius at capitalizing on and organizing what is not at all spiritual, but merely psychologically pathetic. This is his follow on to the previous sentence. Remember, this is Kenneth. When he says pathetic, he doesn't mean bad. He means suffering from pathos. He's talking about character types that don't have any ownership over their own character. People who don't take responsibility for the issues and problems in their character. In other words, the stony ground, the very people that he said would have a hard time picking up Jesus's message, by the church making it a goal to spread Jesus's message to all those people all over the world, they warped the message. And thus they were able to get an enormous number of converts to something other than Jesus's message, the Kool-Aid version that they made of it. And they did it by appealing to the weaknesses in the character of so many people. They exploited the weaknesses instead of healing or therapeutically addressing the problems. They leaned into them and used them as a leash. This is like the way modern advertisers, they want to use your insecurity about your body odor or your hair loss or your teeth or what have you, and they come at you emotionally in ways designed to manipulate you. One of the things he's going to say when we get to the modern world is, advertisers learned that from the medieval church. It was during this 1,000-year period that Europe perfected the Benausos, when people learned how to manipulate the vulnerable, the psychologically pathetic. Where are their buttons? Where are their weaknesses? Who has daddy issues? Right? Like modern dating players do, where they profile women and try to figure out who has daddy issues and how can I push those buttons in order to get them to sleep with me once and then I dump them. That mindset, that banausic manipulative, people exist only as tools or resources or utensils for me to manipulate, says that inevitably develops within the hierarchy of the medieval church, because there was no way they were going to get Jesus's message to be popular to large numbers of people without distorting it. Right? He's telling them they're going to have to take responsibility for things in themselves they don't even believe is there. There's that they're too busy scapegoating other people for making them angry. It's like, but it's your anger, says Jesus. You have to take responsibility for it. That's not going to be popular. So the church changes the message and changes it to things designed to hook people where they're weak. And that allows it to spread rapidly. That's what he's saying here. That's why when Kierkegaard writes that there's such an enormous difference between Jesus and Danish Christianity in the 19th century, the reason for that difference is what Kenneth is explaining here in paragraph 13, that there were these pressures to try to do this thing. Now, of course, Kenneth isn't, and I'm not remotely saying that all or most Christian writers from the medieval period were like this. We're just talking about what the institutional imperial structure was like and why it got that way. And I'll let's do the next sentence while we're at it. He continues, Jesus's subtle moralizing got digested into such a pathological perspective, and indeed grew more saccharine and mendacious with the centuries, until in modern times it blossomed into fantastic cults of puerile sweetness and light, with their cheapened feel-good gospel of happy talk. It's why most people are shocked when they encounter the Jesus of Mark, the cranky Jesus who's had it with his disciples. Who's like, you people are idiots. What I'm trying to say shouldn't be this hard for you to understand. I thought you at least would get it. This Mark says this over. I mean, Jesus says this over and over in Mark to his own. Excuse me, I've got a cough going today. To his own apostles. Walter Kaufmann's Critique of Religion and Philosophy, which doubtless Kenneth has read. That's he likes Kaufmann's books. So,
I mean, he's read everything by Kaufman, so I would assume. But what made me type that was that Kenneth spends a lot of time on Jesus and little time on the medieval church. And when Kaufman looks at religion, Christian religion, he looks at Jesus and he doesn't look anywhere else. I mean, that's the only religious thing there. The church isn't religious in his sense.
right.
So it's an overall perspective, but I have no idea if there's any relationship or not. And I didn't think there was a relationship until we got into this.
Yeah. But now you're hearing echoes of Kaufman in this paragraph.
Yeah, but it's been at least 15 years or more since I read that book. I have, I need some things I talk about in this seminar, I haven't actually looked at for 50 years.
Exciting.
No, there are a lot of books. I know I read that book, but it formed my overall thinking, but I don't remember specifically how. And last week, I had a cough like that, and it turned out to be a sinus infection. It just never got better.
Yeah, I have a propensity to bronchitis. I'll get it at the drop of a hat. And sometimes I get it even if I just haven't drunk enough water today. And that's my
Yeah,
problem today.
yeah, it could be.
So after this call, I'll just drink more water and it'll go away. So let's wrap this up here. We have the end of paragraph 13. After talking about the cheap and feel-good gospel of happy talk, he continues, in the early 1840s, when there was as yet no epidemic of drug abuse, and opium was known primarily as an anesthetic or analgesic, Marx, not Mark, Marx wrote his famous passage on religion. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. And of course, this always gets misquoted, because people are saying, oh, Marx hates religion. He's calling it the opiate of the masses because he detests people. But of course, what Kenneth is trying to do is restore the intent. Like Marx or don't like Marx, at least you got to know what Marx is saying. And he's writing at a time when opium really is it. I mean, if you're in agony, it's opium or nothing. Your only your only way of getting through that pain, like in the Civil War a few decades later, they're cutting off limbs, and your only chance of dealing with that pain, assuming you even survive the amputation, is opium. It's the painkiller you've got. It is the way you make it through an otherwise completely unsalvageable difficult situation. So basically, Marx is not saying, religion is stupid and it's a drug and people shouldn't take it. He's saying people who are in misery need religion. They need it viscerally to give them any chance of making it through the day because it offers them it offers them something that they need that the conditions of their material life are not offering for them. If you like he said in an earlier paragraph about the late Roman Empire, if the classes have ossified and you're a slave, you're going to labor with your body for the rest of your life. You're never going to make enough money to be free. And all the wealth you generate is going to go into the pockets of the people who enslave you. And the harder you work, the more you're enslaved as a result. And there's no prospect. What under those conditions, you need something, and what's being offered is the thing that's on offer to give you a chance to get through it is religion. And it's part of why the revolution that happens in the late Roman Empire is a religious revolution as much as it's economic or political. It's a religious revolution because they need to transform their understanding of the cosmos and morality and human relations to open up some kind of possibility for people to become free, in a way that is otherwise never going to happen under the Roman Empire. This is what Marx is alluding to. And this is why. So this is Kenneth's way of saying, yeah, they did sweeten it. They did water down Jesus' message and they did sweeten it, but it caught on because people really desperately needed the calories. Basically, they needed some kind of hope for life. And the message, the distorted version of Christianity that got institutionalized in the medieval period, at least offered that message. It offered people a chance. And and it didn't entirely jettison Jesus's teachings. They were still there if you could read Latin. And it's why, as we'll see in the rest of the year as we go, some of the most profound Jesus-centric writers are the ones who could read Latin. They could read the book for themselves, and they could dig out the parts that weren't being said in churches, but that had this potential to make us think about a larger world in which we're.
So like Oedipus, they needed a crutch.
Say that again.
Like Oedipus, they needed a crutch.
Yes,
something
they
to
needed
lean
it.
on.
Yeah.
Whether it's alcohol or cigarettes or prescribed pills.
Something.
It's this question of change in yourself, or I'm just going to lean on some external and just stay as I am.
Even if you intend to change yourself, there might be a healing period during which you need the crutch anyway. So,
But it seems to be an evolution, an aspect of evolution. You start off with the creature that's on four legs, the animal, and then you get to the the human that stands on two legs is a primitive human. Now we have the technically sophisticated man who has crutches, who has prosthetics.
Yes.
And of course, who is master?
Yes.
The prosthetic or the man?
Right.
Who rules?
And aren't these themes we're going to explore the heck out of in the modern section? You're right on. So anyway, that's paragraph 13. And you can see how in even just one paragraph, he's taken us from the ancient seeds of Jesus's teachings all the way through to the revolution that led to the modern world and where people find themselves in religion today. This is Kenneth in a nutshell. All right, well, I hope you all had a good time. I had a good time. I love talking with you all. I love your insights. And I guess we will pick this up again next week with paragraph 14, shall we?
Appreciate it, Rick.
Very good week, Rick.
It's always
Bye.
good to see you. Enjoy your
Thanks,
holiday.
Rick. Have a good day, guys.